The Iron Duke had not spoken to another soul in 3 days, and the silence inside Thornfield Castle had grown so heavy that even the stones seemed to hold their breath. Cassian Thornfield stood alone in the northern watchtower as rain hammered against the glass, his reflection distorted in the warped panes. Below, the moors stretched endlessly into darkness, and somewhere beyond those black hills, England's aristocracy was already sharpening their knives. They always did when a man refused to kneel. He pressed one palm flat against the cold stone wall and felt the castle's weight settle into his bones. Power was never given. It was taken, held, and defended until your enemies stopped breathing or you did. That was the only truth that mattered in 1851, and Cassian had carved it into every decision he'd made since inheriting this godforsaken duchy at 17. The world outside these walls wanted him broken. The world inside them wanted him buried. And yet here he stood, undefeated, unmoved, untouched by anything resembling mercy. But if you're still reading, you already know this isn't a story about survival. It's about what happens when survival stops being enough. The scream came from the east wing just before midnight. Cassian's head snapped toward the sound. His hand went instinctively to the blade at his hip before his mind caught up. Servants didn't scream in Thornfield Castle. They learned quickly that noise attracted attention, and attention from the Duke was the last thing anyone wanted. He moved through the corridors with predatory silence, his boots barely whispering against stone floors that had witnessed 3 centuries of Thornfield violence. The scream had cut off abruptly, which meant someone had either been silenced or had silenced themselves. Neither option pleased him. He found Mrs. Daventry in the servants' corridor, her face bloodless, one trembling hand pressed against the wall. "Your Grace," her voice cracked. "Forgive me. I didn't mean to disturb." What happened? It wasn't a question. Cassian's voice carried the kind of cold authority that made grown men forget how to lie. Mrs. Daventry's eyes darted toward the floor. "The new girl? Mary. She broke the china service from the East Parlor. All of it. She's hysterical, Your Grace. Says she can't afford to replace it. Says her family will starve if we dock her wages." Cassian stared at the old woman until she flinched. "Where is she?" "The scullery, Your Grace. But perhaps if you'd allow me to handle—" He was already walking. The scullery was a cramped stone room that smelled of lye and cold grease. A girl no older than 16 sat crumpled in the corner, her apron soaked through with tears and dishwater. When Cassian's shadow fell across her, she looked up and made a sound like a wounded animal. "Please," her voice broke into pieces. "Please, Your Grace, I'll work for free. I'll do anything. Just don't send me away. My mother's sick and my brothers are too young to work, and if I lose this position, they'll—" "Stand up!" The girl's face went white. She tried to push herself upright, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Cassian watched her struggle for exactly 3 seconds before stepping forward and hauling her to her feet with one hand. She weighed nothing. He could feel her pulse hammering against his palm where he gripped her arm. "Look at me." She couldn't. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, her whole body shaking like she expected him to strike her. Cassian's jaw tightened. This was what they all thought of him. This was what he'd built. An empire of fear so complete that a child would rather die than meet his eyes. "The china," he said slowly, "was purchased 40 years ago by my father. It was ugly then, and it's uglier now. You've done me a favor." The girl's head jerked up. "Your Grace?" "Your wages won't be docked. Tell Mrs. Daventry to order a new service from London. Tell her I said the old one was garbage." He released her and turned to leave. Behind him, the girl made a choked sound that might have been gratitude or disbelief. Cassian didn't wait to find out which. Kindness wasn't in his nature. But waste annoyed him, and terrifying a 16-year-old girl into uselessness was a waste of time and resources. That was what he told himself as he climbed the stairs back to his chambers. That was the lie he preferred to the truth. The letter arrived the next morning with the Earl of Pemberton's seal. Cassian broke the wax without ceremony and scanned the contents while his steward, Mr. Harrow, waited by the door with the expression of a man watching someone open a letter bomb. "Your Grace?" Cassian let the paper fall to his desk. "Pemberton wants to renegotiate the border taxes." Renegotiate. Harrow's voice was carefully neutral. That's an interesting word for what he's actually suggesting. He wants me to forgive 70% of what his estates owe and pretend it's compromise. Cassian leaned back in his chair. "He's testing me, seeing if the rumors are true." "What rumors, Your Grace?" That I'm losing my grip. Cassian's smile was the kind that made smart men nervous. That the northern territories are weakening under my rule. That perhaps it's time for more reasonable men to take control of these lands. Harrow said nothing, which was answer enough. Cassian stood and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, workers moved through the fields like ants, harvesting wheat under a gray sky. Every bushel of grain, every lamb born, every coin earned in the northern territories flowed through systems he'd built with his own hands. He'd turned a dying duchy into an empire. He'd crushed rebellions before they could breathe and broken noble houses that thought his age made him vulnerable. And now Pemberton thought he could bleed Thornfield dry through paperwork and political pressure. "Send a reply," Cassian said. "Tell Pemberton I'll renegotiate in person. Arrange a meeting at the hunting lodge in 1 week. Your Grace, with respect, Pemberton will bring allies. This could be a trap." "It is a trap." Cassian's reflection in the glass looked carved from stone. "That's why I'm accepting." Harrow hesitated. "What would you like me to tell him about your terms?" Cassian turned from the window. His eyes were the color of winter storms. "Tell him I don't negotiate." The hunting lodge sat at the border between Thornfield lands and Pemberton's southern estates, a sprawling stone structure that had witnessed more political bloodshed than actual hunting. Cassian arrived exactly on time with 4 men and no illusions. Pemberton had brought 12. The Earl himself was a soft-bodied man in his 50s who'd inherited wealth and mistaken it for intelligence. He sat at the head of the table with the confidence of someone who'd never been truly threatened in his life. "Thornfield." Pemberton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Glad you could make it. I was beginning to think you'd refuse." Cassian sat without being invited. His men remained standing by the door. "Let's skip the pleasantries," Cassian said. "You want to renegotiate taxes. I'm here to tell you why that's not going to happen." Pemberton's smile tightened. "You misunderstand. This isn't a request. The Southern Lords have reached a consensus. Your tax rates are choking trade and damaging the entire region. We're offering you a chance to correct the situation before it escalates." "Escalates." Cassian repeated the word like he was tasting poison. "You're threatening me in my own territory. I'm offering you an opportunity to avoid unpleasantness." Pemberton leaned forward. "The Crown is watching, Thornfield. They're asking questions about how you maintain control up here, about the methods you use, about whether a man your age has the temperament to rule such valuable lands." Around the table, the other lords shifted. Cassian could feel their anticipation like electricity in the air. They wanted him to lose his temper. They wanted him to do something violent and stupid that would justify whatever they'd already planned. He smiled instead. "You think I'm too young," Cassian said softly. "Too aggressive. Too unwilling to compromise with reasonable men like yourself." "I think," Pemberton said carefully, "that you've ruled through fear for too long. That approach works until it doesn't. Until people realize you're just one man, Thornfield, mortal like the rest of us." Cassian stood. Every man in the room tensed. "You want to know how I maintain control?" Cassian walked slowly around the table. "I'll tell you. I make examples. I identify threats before they fully form, and I crush them so completely that no one else dares to try." He stopped behind Pemberton's chair. 3 years ago, Lord Ashford tried to organize a coalition against me. His estates are now mine. 2 years ago, the guildmasters in Newcastle attempted to restrict my trade access. The guilds no longer exist. Last year, a group of merchants from York thought they could undercut my lumber prices. Would you like to know where those merchants are now? Pemberton's face had gone pale. "You're admitting to shit." "I'm admitting nothing." Cassian leaned down until his mouth was beside the Earl's ear. "I'm explaining reality. You came here thinking 12 men would intimidate me. You thought numbers mattered more than will. You were wrong." He straightened and addressed the room. "The tax rates stay. If any of you have a problem with that, you're welcome to take it up with the Crown. But understand this. If you move against me, I won't respond with lawyers or negotiations. I'll respond the way I've always responded. Completely, permanently, without mercy." The silence in the room was absolute. Cassian walked to the door, then paused. "One more thing, Pemberton. The border taxes you already owe? They're due in full by month's end. If you're even 1 day late, I'll consider it an act of war." He left the hunting lodge with Pemberton's rage burning holes in his back and the absolute certainty that he'd just accelerated whatever the Southern Lords had been planning. Good. Waiting for enemies to strike first was how weak men died. The attack came 3 nights later. Cassian woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of steel on steel somewhere below. He was out of bed and armed before his mind fully cleared, moving on instinct and years of sleeping like a soldier in his own home. The corridor outside his chambers was empty, but he could hear shouting from the main hall. He took the servants' stairs down and emerged behind the fighting. 7 men in dark clothing had forced their way through the kitchen entrance. 3 of his guards were already down. The invaders weren't trying to steal anything. They were moving methodically toward the main staircase, toward his chambers, toward him. Cassian stepped out of the shadows and cut down the first man before anyone realized he was there. The man's scream alerted the others, but by then it was too late. Cassian moved through them like death with a blade, every strike calculated and fatal. He'd learned to fight from men who believed survival was more important than honor, and he'd perfected the skill in dozens of midnight ambushes just like this one. The last man standing dropped his weapon and raised his hands. "Please," he gasped. "Mercy, I have children." Cassian's sword didn't waver. "Who sent you?" "I don't know. We were hired in London, paid in gold. They just said to kill the Duke and make it look like a robbery." "How many more?" "This was everyone, I swear, just 7 of us." Cassian studied the man's face for exactly 5 seconds. He was lying. Not about the number, but about something. The way his eyes kept darting toward the door, the way his breathing was too controlled for someone truly terrified. "You were expecting someone else," Cassian said softly. "Someone who was supposed to meet you here." The man's face confirmed it. Cassian drove his blade through the man's chest before he could speak, then turned as footsteps echoed from the main hall. "Your Grace!" Harrow appeared in the doorway, his face gray. "We've secured the grounds. 3 more men were waiting outside, but we've captured them. Your Grace, this was coordinated. Professional." "I know." Cassian cleaned his blade on a dead man's coat. "Pemberton moved faster than I expected. Gather the prisoners. I want to know everything by morning." "And if they don't talk?" Cassian's expression didn't change. "They'll talk." By dawn, Thornfield Castle's dungeons had yielded 3 names, 2 locations, and enough evidence to hang Pemberton 6 times over. The problem was that evidence meant nothing when your enemy had friends in Parliament and the Crown's ear. Cassian stood in his study as the sun rose over the moors and realized he was at a crossroads. He could go after Pemberton directly, burn his estates, destroy his reputation, make him an example that would echo through England for decades. It was what his father would have done, what every Thornfield before him had done when challenged. Or he could play the long game, use the evidence to build political pressure, form alliances with other noble houses, fight this war the way civilized men fought, with papers and politics instead of swords. The thought made him physically ill. "Your Grace," Mrs. Daventry's voice interrupted his thoughts. "There's a carriage approaching. They're flying the Vale family colors." Cassian frowned. The Vales were minor nobility from the Midlands. Their estate was 3 days' ride south, and he couldn't remember ever having business with them. "Did they send notice?" "No, Your Grace. The messenger at the gate says Lord Vale requests immediate audience. He says it's urgent." Cassian's instincts prickled. Nothing good ever arrived unannounced at dawn. "Show him to the receiving hall. I'll be down shortly." Lord Edmund Vale looked like a man being digested by his own anxiety. He was thin, hollow-eyed, and dressed in clothing that had been expensive once but now showed signs of age. He barely made it through the formal introductions before words started spilling out of him like water from a cracked dam. "Your Grace, I apologize for the intrusion. I wouldn't presume on your time if the situation weren't desperate. You see, my estates have fallen on difficult times. Bad investments, crop failures, debts that I can no longer service. The banks are threatening foreclosure, and I have nowhere else to turn." Cassian listened without expression. He'd heard versions of this speech before. Desperate men coming to beg for loans or mercy or some combination of the two. He usually sent them away with nothing but advice to manage their finances better. "Why come to me?" Cassian said flatly. Vale's Adam's apple bobbed. "Because I know you value direct solutions. I have something you might want, something that could benefit us both. I'm not a moneylender, Vale. If you need capital, go to London. It's not money I'm offering." Vale's voice dropped. "It's my daughter." The room went very still. Cassian's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "Lady Seraphina. She's 22, educated, well-mannered. She would make an excellent Duchess." Vale's words came faster now, desperate. I know you've avoided marriage, Your Grace, but consider the advantages. The Vale family has connections throughout the Midlands. Our alliance would strengthen your southern borders and give you legitimate ties to moderate houses in Parliament. And in return, I'm only asking for enough to settle my debts and save my family from ruin. Cassian stared at the man. The sheer audacity of it should have been impressive. Vale was trying to sell his daughter like livestock to solve his gambling debts or whatever stupidity had bankrupted his estates. You're asking me to buy your daughter. Vale flinched but didn't deny it. I'm asking you to consider a mutually beneficial arrangement. Marriages have been contracted for less important reasons, Your Grace. And Seraphina is a remarkable young woman, beautiful, intelligent, strong-willed. She would be an asset to Thornfield. Does she know you're here? Vale's silence was answer enough. Cassian should have thrown him out, should have sent Vale back to his dying estates with nothing but contempt. Marriage was a cage that turned men soft and distracted. He'd avoided it for years precisely because he understood what power cost and how easily the wrong partnership could destroy everything he'd built. But then his mind caught on something Vale had said. Connections in Parliament, legitimate ties to moderate houses. He thought about Pemberton and the 12 lords in the hunting lodge, about the attack 3 nights ago, and the political war that was coming whether he wanted it or not, about how much easier it would be to fight that war with allies instead of enemies, about how marriage to the right woman could be armor instead of a cage. I'll meet her, Cassian heard himself say. If she agrees to this arrangement of her own free will, I'll consider it. If she doesn't, you leave my lands and never return. Those are my terms. Vale's relief was pathetic to witness. Thank you, Your Grace. I'll send for her immediately. She'll be here within the week. After Vale left, Harrow appeared from the doorway where he'd been listening. Your Grace, forgive me, but this seems rash. You don't need a wife, especially not one acquired through her father's desperation. Cassian stared out the window at the northern territories that he'd bled to control. I need allies, Harrow. Real ones, the kind that can't be bought or intimidated. He turned to face his steward. And I need them before Pemberton convinces the crown that I'm a mad dog that needs to be put down. So you're going to marry a woman you've never met because her father is bankrupt? I'm going to meet a woman whose father is desperate enough to gamble everything on this arrangement. Cassian's expression was unreadable. If she's strong enough to survive that kind of father, she might be strong enough to survive me. Harrow said nothing. He knew better than to argue when the Duke's mind was made up. But as Cassian returned to his study and the pile of evidence against Pemberton that he couldn't yet use, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Doubt. He'd just agreed to meet a woman who might become his wife, a woman who would be dragged into his world of violence and political warfare whether she wanted it or not, a woman whose father had just sold her future to save himself. And somewhere deep in the part of himself that Cassian had learned to ignore years ago, a voice whispered that this was wrong. That using another person as a weapon in his endless war made him exactly the monster everyone already believed him to be. He silenced the voice the way he always did, by reminding himself that monsters were the only things that survived in this world. And if Lady Seraphina Vale was about to enter his life, she would learn that truth soon enough. Lady Seraphina Vale arrived at Thornfield Castle on a gray morning that threatened rain, and Cassian knew immediately that her father had lied about everything. She wasn't beautiful in the way Vale had promised. She was something more dangerous, the kind of beautiful that lived in sharp intelligence, and the way she carried herself like she knew exactly what her father had done and had decided to face it anyway. She stepped out of the carriage with her spine straight and her eyes clear, and when she looked up at the castle looming above her, she didn't flinch. Cassian watched from the window of his study as she said something to her maid that made the older woman laugh. Then she turned toward the main entrance, and her expression shifted into something careful and controlled. She was preparing herself. For him. Mrs. Daventry showed her to the receiving hall while Cassian took his time descending the stairs. He wanted to see how she handled the weight, wanted to see if uncertainty would break through that careful control. When he finally entered the room, Lady Seraphina was standing by the window, studying the grounds with the kind of attention that suggested she was cataloging escape routes. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and their eyes met for the first time. Something in Cassian's chest went very still. She should have been afraid. Every person who'd ever stood in this room waiting for him had been afraid, but Lady Seraphina looked at him with the expression of someone assessing a dangerous animal and deciding exactly how much space to give it. Lady Seraphina. His voice came out colder than he'd intended. Your father spoke highly of you. I'm sure he did. Her voice was steady. I imagine he was very persuasive. Cassian's eyes narrowed. You know why you're here. Of course. She didn't look away. My father is bankrupt and desperate. He thinks selling me to the infamous Iron Duke will solve his problems. And you think marrying into a Midlands family will give you political cover for whatever war you're currently fighting. The bluntness caught him off guard. Cassian was used to people dancing around unpleasant truths, burying them under layers of propriety and careful language. You're angry, he observed. I'm realistic. Lady Seraphina moved away from the window. My father made his choices. Now I have to make mine. So let's be clear about what this is, Your Grace. You're not looking for a wife. You're looking for an alliance. And I'm not looking for love. I'm looking for survival. Survival, Cassian repeated the word. You think you need protection. I think I need a future that doesn't involve watching my mother starve because my father gambled away everything we had. Her jaw tightened. He told me you're ruthless, that you rule through fear and crush anyone who challenges you. He said marrying you would be like walking into a cage with a wolf. And yet you came anyway. I came because wolves are predictable, Your Grace. They bite. They kill. They follow instinct. Lady Seraphina's eyes were gray like winter fog. Men like my father are worse. They smile while they destroy you. At least with a wolf you know where you stand. Cassian stared at her. This woman had just compared him to an animal and somehow made it sound like a compliment. Or maybe an insult. He couldn't quite tell. I won't pretend to be something I'm not, he said, finally. If we marry, your life will be difficult, dangerous. You'll be pulled into conflicts you didn't choose. My enemies will become yours. The nobility will judge you. Some will try to use you against me. And you think I can't handle that? I think most people can't. Lady Seraphina smiled for the first time since entering the room. It was a small, sharp thing. Then I suppose you'll find out if I'm like most people. Something shifted in the air between them. Cassian felt it like a physical thing, dangerous and unexpected. I need time to consider this, he said. Take all the time you need, Your Grace. Lady Seraphina moved toward the door. But understand something. If I agree to this marriage, it won't be because my father forced me. It will be because I chose it. Because I decided you were less terrible than the alternatives. She paused at the threshold. And if I ever change my mind about that, no castle walls will keep me here. Then she was gone, leaving Cassian alone in the receiving hall with the unfamiliar sensation of having been outmaneuvered in his own home. Harrow appeared a moment later, his expression somewhere between concerned and amused. Well, Your Grace? Cassian was still staring at the empty doorway. Schedule the wedding, he said quietly, 2 weeks from now. Your Grace, are you certain? You barely spoke with her. I'm certain. Cassian's voice was flat. Lady Seraphina Vale just walked into Thornfield Castle knowing exactly what I am and refused to be afraid. That's either courage or insanity. And if it's insanity, Cassian's expression was unreadable. Then she'll fit right in. The wedding was scheduled for the first day of autumn, and Cassian spent the 2 weeks leading up to it preparing for war. Pemberton had gone silent after the assassination attempt, which meant he was either regrouping or planning something worse. The southern lords were circling like carrion birds, waiting to see if Thornfield would show weakness. And now Cassian was about to marry a woman he barely knew in front of the same nobles who wanted him dead. The night before the wedding, he found himself unable to sleep. He stood on the castle battlements watching storm clouds gather over the moors and tried to remember the last time he'd made a decision that felt this irreversible. Can't sleep either? Cassian turned to find Lady Seraphina standing a few feet away, wrapped in a dark cloak. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she looked younger in the moonlight, less controlled. You shouldn't be out here, he said. Why? Because it's improper for the bride to see the groom before the wedding? Her smile was dry. I think we're past worrying about propriety, Your Grace. She came to stand beside him at the wall. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Second thoughts? Cassian asked finally. Constantly. Lady Seraphina stared out at the darkness. But I'm still here. Why? She turned to look at him. Because you were honest. When my father brought me here, you didn't pretend this was a love match. You didn't lie about what kind of man you are. And in a world full of men who smile while they destroy you, that honesty is worth something. Cassian felt something tighten in his chest. You don't know me, Lady Seraphina. You don't know what I've done to build this empire. No, she agreed, but I know what my father did to destroy his, and given the choice between a man who builds through strength and a man who destroys through weakness, I'll choose strength every time. Lightning flickered on the horizon. Thunder followed seconds later. Tomorrow, Cassian said quietly, everything changes. For both of us. Lady Seraphina's expression was impossible to read in the shadows. Then I suppose we'd better be ready. She left him standing on the battlements as the storm rolled closer, and Cassian realized with sudden clarity that he just made the most dangerous decision of his life. Not because Lady Seraphina Vale was weak, but because she wasn't. And somewhere in the darkness, his enemies were already sharpening their knives, waiting for the moment when the Iron Duke's new weakness would finally give them the opening they needed. The wedding would be a declaration. The question was whether it would be a declaration of strength or the beginning of his end. The ceremony took place in Thornfield's great hall under a sky that couldn't decide between rain and violence. Cassian stood at the altar in formal black, while 200 of England's most powerful families watched from pews that had witnessed 3 centuries of Thornfield marriages, and every single one of them was waiting for him to fail. He could feel their anticipation like static in the air. The Iron Duke finally taking a wife. The ruthless bastard who'd ruled through fear for 8 years, suddenly gambling everything on a political marriage to a minor noble's daughter. They were all wondering the same thing, whether this was strength or the first crack in armor that had never shown weakness before. Lord Pemberton sat in the third row with a smile that promised blood. The doors opened and Lady Seraphina entered on her father's arm wearing white silk that made her look like a ghost walking toward her own funeral. But her spine was straight and her eyes were clear, and when she reached the altar and looked at Cassian, there was no fear in her face, only calculation. She was measuring him the same way he'd measured 100 enemies before cutting them down. The priest began speaking words that Cassian barely heard. His attention was locked on the woman beside him. On the way, her pulse jumped in her throat when he took her hand, on the slight pressure of her fingers against his palm, like she was testing his grip. On the moment their eyes met during the vows, and something silent passed between them that felt like a challenge being issued from both sides at once. Then the priest said the words that made it permanent. You may kiss your bride. Cassian turned toward Seraphina and saw her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She was bracing herself. For him, for this, for whatever came after the performance ended and the reality began. He leaned down slowly enough that she could have pulled away if she wanted to, and pressed his mouth to hers in a kiss that lasted exactly 3 seconds and tasted like a contract being signed in blood. When he pulled back, her eyes were wide, but her expression was controlled. The hall erupted in polite applause that covered a dozen different flavors of malice. They were married, and Cassian's enemies had just been given their first real target in years. The feast afterward was a carefully orchestrated nightmare. Every noble house in attendance brought gifts that were really weapons. Pemberton presented a hunting knife with Thornfield's crest engraved on the blade, and a smile that said he knew exactly where he wanted to put it. Lady Ashworth from the Eastern Estates gave them a painting of the castle with storm clouds gathering overhead. Lord Stratton offered a toast about how marriage civilized even the wildest men, and made sure everyone in the hall understood the insult. Cassian sat through it all with the expression of a man watching insects crawl across his dinner plate, mildly irritated, but not concerned. Beside him, Seraphina played her role flawlessly. She smiled at the right moments, thanked the guests for their poisonous generosity, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and when Pemberton leaned across the table during the third course to tell her that Thornfield Castle had quite the reputation for being inhospitable to outsiders, she looked him directly in the eye and said that she'd always enjoyed a challenge. Pemberton's smile faltered. Cassian felt something almost like satisfaction. His new wife had teeth. The trouble started 3 hours into the feast when Lord Harwick from the Southern Territories drank too much wine and decided to test how far he could push before the Duke broke. He stood with his glass raised and his face flushed, and addressed the hall in a voice designed to carry, a toast to the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield. May their union bring warmth to these cold northern lands, and may the Duchess succeed where so many others have failed in teaching our dear Duke the value of compromise. The hall went quiet. It was the kind of quiet that preceded violence. Cassian's hand tightened on his glass, but his expression didn't change. Across the table, Harrow's eyes widened in warning. The guards along the walls shifted their weight. Everyone knew what happened when someone pushed the Iron Duke too far. But before Cassian could respond, Seraphina stood. "Lord Harwick," she said with a smile that could have cut glass, "how kind of you to be concerned about my husband's education. But I assure you the Duke needs no instruction from me on the value of compromise. He's simply never met anyone worth compromising with." She let the words hang in the air for exactly 2 seconds. "Perhaps that will change someday. Though, judging by present company, I wouldn't hold my breath." Harwick's face went from red to purple. Half the hall looked stunned. The other half looked delighted that someone had finally drawn blood. And Pemberton's expression suggested he was rapidly recalculating everything he thought he knew about the new Duchess. Seraphina sat down like nothing had happened and took a sip of wine. Cassian stared at her. At this woman who'd just publicly humiliated a lord in defense of a husband she barely knew. Who'd stood up in a room full of people who wanted to see her fail and refused to give them the satisfaction. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "I know." Seraphina's voice was steady. "But he insulted you in your own hall. I wasn't going to sit there and smile while he did it. Why not? Most people would." She turned to look at him. "I'm not most people, Your Grace. I thought we'd established that." Something in Cassian's chest tightened. He'd married this woman for political advantage, for the connections her family name would bring, for the armor that a duchess could provide against accusations that he was nothing but a violent thug ruling through fear. He hadn't expected her to actually defend him, hadn't expected her to care. "Call me Cassian," he heard himself say. "We're married now. The formality is unnecessary." Seraphina's eyes widened slightly. It was the first time he'd seen her surprised. "Cassian," she repeated, testing his name like a new weapon. Then she nodded once. "And you can call me Seraphina, though I imagine you'll mostly just call me Trouble before this is over." Despite everything, Cassian almost smiled. "I imagine you're right." The feast ended near midnight, and the guests departed with varying degrees of reluctance. Cassian stood in the entrance hall watching carriages roll away into darkness, while Seraphina said goodbye to her father with the warmth of someone shaking hands with a business partner. Lord Vale looked relieved to be leaving, to have successfully sold his daughter and escaped with enough money to save his crumbling estates. He didn't even glance back as his carriage disappeared down the drive. "He's not coming back," Seraphina said quietly. Cassian turned to look at her. "Would you want him to?" "No." Her voice was flat. "He made his choice. Now I've made mine." She walked past him toward the main staircase, her white wedding dress trailing behind her like a ghost. Cassian watched her go and felt the full weight of what he'd just done settle into his bones. This woman was his responsibility now, his wife, his problem. And if his enemies came for him the way he knew they would, she would be standing in the crossfire, whether she wanted to be or not. He followed her up the stairs. They'd given Seraphina chambers adjoining his own. It was the expected arrangement for a duke and duchess, though most noble marriages involved separate wings of the castle and carefully scheduled visits. Cassian had never been interested in expectations, but he also hadn't been interested in marriage until 2 weeks ago, and now he was following his new wife down a corridor trying to figure out what the hell happened next. Seraphina stopped at her door and turned to face him. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her hands were clenched at her sides. "I assume you have certain expectations," she said, "about tonight." Cassian stared at her. "Expectations? We're married. There are responsibilities that come with that. I'm prepared to fulfill them." Her voice was steady, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was holding herself too still. She was afraid. Not of him specifically, of what marriage meant, of what he might demand, of the loss of control that came with being another man's property in the eyes of the law. Something cold and sharp twisted in Cassian's gut. He'd spent 8 years building an empire on fear, on the absolute certainty that strength was the only thing that mattered, and compromise was just a word weak men used before they died. He'd crushed rebellions and destroyed enemies and never once questioned whether the cost was too high, because the cost of weakness was death, and he'd chosen survival every single time. But standing in this corridor, looking at a woman who'd just defended him in front of his enemies and was now bracing herself for him to hurt her, Cassian felt something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. "Go to bed, Seraphina." She blinked. "What?" "You're exhausted. It's been a long day. Go to bed. But I thought, I don't care what you thought. His voice came out harsher than he intended. I'm not going to touch you. Not tonight. Not until you want me to. Serafina stared at him like he'd just spoken a foreign language. You're my husband. You don't need my permission. Yes, Cassian said quietly. I do. The silence between them was heavy with something he couldn't name. Serafina's expression shifted through confusion and suspicion before landing on something that might have been relief or might have been disappointment. He couldn't tell which. Thank you, she said finally. Cassian nodded once and turned toward his own chambers. Behind him, he heard her door close softly. He stood alone in the corridor for a long moment, trying to figure out what the hell he was doing. He'd just married a woman he barely knew for purely strategic reasons. He should be treating this like the business arrangement it was. Should be maintaining distance and control, and all the things that had kept him alive and in power for 8 years. Instead, he'd just promised not to touch her without permission, which meant he'd just given her power over him. And power was the one thing Cassian Thornfield never gave anyone. He went to bed alone and spent the night staring at the ceiling, wondering if marriage was going to destroy him faster than his enemies could. The answer came 3 days later in the form of a letter with the crown's seal. Cassian broke the wax in his study, while Harrow watched with the expression of a man who'd just seen storm clouds gather on a clear day. The letter was brief and polite, and absolutely devastating. His Majesty requests your presence in London to address concerns regarding governance of the Northern Territories. You are to appear before the Privy Council within the fortnight to answer questions about recent disturbances and allegations of excessive force in maintaining order. Cassian read it twice before setting it down carefully on his desk. They're calling me to answer for Pemberton's assassination attempt, he said flatly. It appears so, Your Grace. Harrow's voice was grim. Pemberton must have convinced the Crown that you're unstable, that the attack was your fault somehow, that you provoked it through tyrannical behavior. I did provoke it. I refused to let him steal from me. That's not how he'll present it in London. He'll say you're a danger to the realm, that you rule through terror and violence, that you need to be brought to heel before you start a civil war. Cassian leaned back in his chair and stared at the letter. This was the endgame Pemberton had been building toward. Not a direct attack, not an assassination, but a political execution. Get the Crown to question his authority, force him to defend himself in front of the Privy Council where his enemies had already spent months poisoning the well, make him look weak and defensive and desperate, and if he refused to go to London, they'd call it treason. What will you do? Harrow asked. I'll go. Cassian's voice was cold as winter stone. I'll stand before the Privy Council and I'll answer their questions. And then I'll make Pemberton regret ever thinking he could beat me with paperwork. Your Grace, if you go to London, you'll be walking into a trap. I know. Cassian stood and moved to the window. Below, the Northern Territories stretched toward the horizon. Everything he'd built, everything he'd bled to control. But if I don't go, I hand them the excuse they need to strip my title and redistribute my lands. At least this way, I have a chance to fight back. Harrow said nothing. There was nothing to say. They both knew Cassian was right. The knock on the door interrupted them. Mrs. Daventry entered with her face tight with concern. Your Grace, the Duchess is asking for you. She's in the library. Cassian exchanged a look with Harrow. Serafina had spent the last 3 days exploring the castle and learning the rhythms of her new home. She'd been careful to stay out of his way. They'd had dinner together each evening and maintained polite conversation, but the distance between them was obvious. She was his wife on paper. In practice, they were strangers sharing a castle. He found her in the library, surrounded by books and maps with that same focused intensity she'd had on the battlements before their wedding. She looked up when he entered and he saw immediately that something had changed. The careful neutrality was gone. In its place was cold fury. Is it true? Her voice was sharp. Are they summoning you to London? Cassian went very still. How did you know about that? Because I'm not stupid and this castle has servants who talk. Serafina stood. Is it true? Yes. Because of Pemberton. Yes. She started pacing. He tried to have you killed and now he's using the Crown to finish the job. He's betting that you'll either refuse to go and look guilty, or you'll go and he'll have you surrounded by his allies with no way to fight back. Cassian watched her move across the room. That's an accurate assessment. Then don't go. If I don't go, they'll call it treason. And if you do go, they'll trap you in London while Pemberton moves against your territories here. Serafina turned to face him. This is a losing game, Cassian. He's forcing you to choose between your lands and your reputation. Either way, you lose. I'm aware. So what are you going to do? Cassian met her eyes. I'm going to London. I'm going to stand before the Privy Council and answer their questions. And then I'm going to destroy Pemberton so completely that no one else ever tries this again. Serafina stared at him. You can't fight politics with violence. That's what he's counting on. The moment you lose your temper or threaten anyone in front of the crown, you prove everything he's been saying about you. I know. Then what's your plan? I don't have one yet. The admission hung in the air between them. Cassian had spent 8 years never entering a fight without knowing exactly how it would end. He crushed problems before they could grow. He anticipated threats and eliminated them. He controlled every variable because control was the only thing standing between him and death. But this time, he was walking into an ambush with no clear path to victory. And the woman staring at him with fury in her eyes had just articulated every fear he'd been trying to ignore for the last 3 days. You need allies, Serafina said suddenly. Real ones. Not people who fear you, people who will stand with you in front of the crown and vouch for your character. I don't have those kinds of allies. Yes, you do. She moved closer. You have me. Cassian's jaw tightened. You've been my wife for 3 days, Serafina. The Privy Council won't care what you have to say. They will if I say it right. Her eyes were fierce. My family has connections throughout the Midlands. Minor nobility who don't love Pemberton and don't want to see the Northern Territories fall into chaos. If I send letters, if I call in favors my father never bothered to use, I can build you a coalition of moderate voices who will testify that you're not the monster Pemberton claims. Why would you do that? The question came out harder than Cassian intended. But he needed to know, needed to understand why this woman who barely knew him was suddenly offering to wade into a political war that could destroy her family's name if she chose the wrong side. Serafina's expression softened slightly. Because you gave me a choice that first night. You could have demanded anything, and I would have had no legal right to refuse. But you didn't. You told me to go to bed, and you left me alone. And that's more respect than I've gotten from any man in my entire life. Something in Cassian's chest cracked open, a place he'd kept locked for so long he'd forgotten it existed. One act of basic decency doesn't make me a good man, Serafina. I'm not asking you to be good. Her voice was steady. I'm asking you to let me help you survive. Because if you go down, I go down with you. And I didn't agree to this marriage just to watch my husband get destroyed by men like Pemberton who think power is something you inherit instead of something you earn. Cassian stared at her, at this woman who'd been sold into marriage to save her father's debts and had somehow decided that her ruthless new husband was worth defending, at this Duchess who'd spent 3 days in his castle and already understood the game better than lords who'd been playing it their entire lives. All right, he said quietly, write your letters, build your coalition. But understand something, Serafina. If you do this, you're choosing a side. My enemies will become yours. There's no going back from that. I know. She didn't look away. I'm choosing anyway. The silence between them was different this time, heavier, more dangerous. Like they'd just crossed a line that neither of them had meant to cross but couldn't uncross now, even if they wanted to. We leave for London in 1 week, Cassian said. That gives you 7 days to call in whatever favors you can. Serafina nodded. I'll need access to your correspondence network, and I'll need to know everything about Pemberton's allies, names, weaknesses, anything I can use. Hera will give you whatever you need. Good. She moved toward the door, then paused. Cassian? Yes? Don't do anything stupid before we get to London. No threats, no violence, no proving Pemberton right. Cassian's expression was unreadable. I can't promise that. Then promise me you'll try. He looked at her for a long moment, at the determination in her face, at the way she was already fighting for him, even though he'd given her every reason not to. I'll try, he said finally. It was the closest thing to a concession he'd made in years. And as Serafina left the library to begin writing letters that would either save them or destroy them both, Cassian stood alone among the books and maps and felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He'd built an empire on fear and strength and absolute control, but his new Duchess was teaching him something more dangerous. Trust. And in the world Cassian Thornfield had created for himself, trust was the fastest way to get killed. The week before London passed in a blur of preparation and barely controlled chaos. Serafina worked 16-hour days in the library, writing letters to every moderate house she could think of. She called in favors her family had accumulated over generations. She promised alliances and support and careful political maneuvering in exchange for testimony that would counter Pemberton's narrative. And slowly, painfully, she began to build something that looked almost like a coalition. Meanwhile, Cassian fortified Thornfield against whatever would come during his absence. He met with his stewards and captains. He reinforced defenses and established protocols for handling threats. He made it clear to every servant and soldier in his employ that if Pemberton tried anything while the Duke was in London, the response would be immediate and permanent. They saw each other at dinner each night, and the conversations became less careful, more honest. Serafina told him about growing up in a house where money was always running out, and her father was always gambling it away. About learning to manage estates at 14 because no one else would. About the quiet rage that came from watching your family destroy itself and being powerless to stop it. Cassian found himself telling her things he'd never told anyone. About inheriting the duchy at 17 and discovering that every noble in the north was waiting for him to fail. About the first time he'd had to kill someone who challenged his authority. About the gradual realization that fear was the only language these people understood, and kindness would get him killed before his 20th birthday. "Do you regret it?" Serafina asked on the 5th night. "Becoming what you are?" Cassian was quiet for a long time. "I regret that I had to, but I don't regret surviving. That's not the same thing as being happy." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Serafina's expression was thoughtful. "What would make you happy, Cassian, if you could have anything?" He looked at her across the table. At this woman who'd appeared in his life 3 weeks ago and already understood him better than people he'd known for years. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've spent so long just trying to survive that I forgot to want anything else." Something soft passed across Serafina's face, almost like sadness. "Then maybe it's time to start remembering." The night before they left for London, Cassian found himself standing outside Serafina's door at midnight with no clear idea why he was there. He should be sleeping, should be preparing mentally for the battle ahead, should be doing anything except hovering in a corridor like a nervous fool trying to work up the courage to knock. The door opened before he could decide. Serafina stood in her nightgown with her hair loose and her eyes slightly red like she'd been crying. When she saw him, surprise flickered across her face. "Cassian, what's wrong?" "Nothing?" He felt ridiculous now. "I just wanted to check that you had everything you needed for tomorrow." It was a transparent lie, and they both knew it. Serafina studied him for a long moment, then stepped back from the door. "Come in." Cassian hesitated. They'd maintained careful boundaries since the wedding night, separate chambers, minimal physical contact. The marriage was real on paper, but in practice, they were still strangers navigating unfamiliar territory. Going into her room at midnight would change that. He went in anyway. Serafina's chambers were simpler than he expected. Books everywhere, maps spread across the desk, a fire burning low in the hearth. She'd made this space her own in less than a week, and somehow it already felt more alive than his own rooms ever had. "You're nervous about tomorrow," Serafina said. It wasn't a question. "No." "Liar." Cassian's jaw tightened. "I'm not afraid of Pemberton or the Privy Council." "I didn't say afraid. I said nervous." Serafina moved to the window. "There's a difference. Fear is about dying. Nervousness is about failing people who depend on you." She turned to look at him. "You're nervous because for the first time in years you're not fighting alone, and you don't know if that makes you stronger or if it just gave your enemies more hostages." Cassian stared at her. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "See through me like I'm made of glass." Serafina's smile was sad. "Because I spent my whole childhood watching my father lie to himself about why everything was falling apart. I learned to see the truth people try to hide, even from themselves." She crossed the room until she was standing directly in front of him, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, close enough that he could see the pulse jumping in her throat. "You're not going to fail," she said quietly. "We're going to walk into that council chamber together, and we're going to show them exactly who you are. Not the monster Pemberton created, the man who rules because he's strong enough to carry the weight when everyone else gave up. Cassian's hand moved before he could stop it. His fingers brushed her cheek and she went very still. You shouldn't trust me, Serafina. I know. I'm everything they say I am. Ruthless, dangerous, incapable of caring about anything except power. I know that too. Then why are you still here? Her eyes were gray like winter fog and just as impossible to read. Because I think you're lying. I think somewhere under all that iron and ice, there's a man who remembers what it's like to want something more than survival. And I think that scares you more than any enemy ever could. Cassian's throat went tight. She was right. Completely, devastatingly right. This woman he barely knew had just reached into his chest and pulled out the truth he'd been hiding from himself for 8 years. He was terrified. Not of Pemberton, not of the Privy Council, not even of death, but of the possibility that he might actually care about someone enough to get hurt when he lost them. Serafina. She kissed him before he could finish. It wasn't like their wedding kiss. That had been performance, contract. This was something else entirely, desperate and fierce, and tasting like a choice being made that neither of them could take back. Cassian's hand slid into her hair, and she made a small sound against his mouth, and suddenly they were pressed together with 8 years of isolation and 3 weeks of tension burning between them like wildfire. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Was that permission? Cassian's voice came out rough. Serafina's eyes were dark. Yes. You're sure? I'm sure. Her hands fisted in his shirt. I'm tired of being careful. I'm tired of pretending this is just politics. I'm tired of acting like I don't feel something every time you look at me like I'm the most dangerous thing you've ever encountered. Cassian's laugh was low and almost painful. You are the most dangerous thing I've ever encountered. Good. Serafina pulled him toward the bed. Then maybe we actually have a chance. They didn't sleep that night, and when dawn came and they prepared to leave for London, something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer strangers playing roles in a political marriage. They were allies, partners, something more dangerous than either of those things. They were becoming each other's weakness in a world that punished weakness with death. The journey to London took 3 days, and the closer they got to the capital, the tighter Cassian's jaw became. Serafina watched him retreat behind walls she'd only just started to breach and knew he was preparing for war. Shutting down everything soft, becoming the Iron Duke that England feared. She didn't try to stop him. She understood survival. But she also understood that the man she'd spent the night with was still in there somewhere, and she was betting everything that when the moment came, she could pull him back out. They arrived in London on a gray afternoon that matched Cassian's mood perfectly. The city was massive and loud and full of people who didn't care about northern politics or ducal authority. Here, Cassian was just another nobleman summoned to explain himself, just another potential problem for the crown to solve. Their lodgings were in a townhouse that had belonged to Thornfield dukes for generations. It was smaller than the castle, but still impressive. Still built like a fortress. Cassian inspected every room personally before allowing Serafina to settle in. Old habits, survival instincts that ran deeper than trust. The summons said to appear before the Privy Council in 2 days. 2 days to prepare for a battle that would determine everything. That night, Serafina's letters began bearing fruit. Moderate nobles started arriving at the townhouse requesting quiet meetings. Lord Ashworth from the Midlands, Lady Pembroke from the Eastern Estates, Sir Edmund Carstairs from a minor family that controlled strategic river crossings. One by one, they came. And one by one, Serafina worked her particular magic. She didn't ask them to like Cassian. She asked them to fear what would happen if Pemberton's coalition succeeded in breaking the northern territories. She painted a picture of chaos and redistribution of power. She made them understand that their interests aligned with Thornfield's, whether they hated the Duke or not. By the second night, she'd secured testimony from 8 different houses. It wasn't enough to guarantee victory, but it was enough to make Pemberton sweat. Cassian watched her work with something close to awe. This was a different kind of power than he'd ever wielded. Subtler, more complex. She was building alliances through empathy and shared interest instead of fear. She was showing these nobles that cooperation could protect them better than submission. She was doing what he'd never learned how to do. She was teaching them to choose her instead of forcing them to obey. "You're staring," Serafina said without looking up from her correspondence. They were alone in the study. The last of the evening's visitors had left an hour ago. Outside, London continued its endless noise. I'm impressed, Cassian admitted. Don't be. This is just survival in a different form. She set down her pen. Your way works in the north, where distances are vast and responses need to be immediate. But here in London, everything moves slower, more layers. You need different weapons. You make it look easy. It's not. Serafina's expression was tired. Every one of those nobles left here still afraid of you, still convinced you're a dangerous man who rules through violence. I didn't change their minds. I just gave them a reason to pretend otherwise for a few hours in front of the crown. Cassian moved closer. Is that what you think? That I'm dangerous? I know you're dangerous. Serafina stood. But I also know you're more than that. And tomorrow, we're going to make the Privy Council see it too. And if we fail? She reached up and touched his face. Then we fail together. But we're not going to fail, Cassian, because I didn't spend 2 weeks building this coalition just to watch Pemberton win. Her confidence was intoxicating, dangerous. Cassian wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that her carefully constructed alliances would be enough to counter 8 years of reputation and Pemberton's political machinery. But he'd spent too long surviving on cynicism to start believing in miracles now. Go to bed, he said quietly. Tomorrow's going to be brutal. Serafina's eyes searched his face. Are you coming? The question hung between them, loaded with implications. They'd shared one night, one moment of weakness where walls came down and truth spilled out. But that didn't mean they'd made any promises. Didn't mean this was anything more than two people seeking comfort before battle. Cassian kissed her forehead. Not tonight. I need to think. Disappointment flickered across her face, but she nodded. Don't think too hard. You'll talk yourself into something stupid. After she left, Cassian stood alone in the study and tried to figure out when exactly his carefully controlled life had spiraled so completely out of his control. 3 weeks ago, he'd been the Iron Duke, untouchable, unmoved, alone by choice because alone was safer. Now he was standing in a London townhouse the night before facing judgment with a wife he couldn't stop thinking about, and a coalition of allies he didn't trust, and the growing certainty that he was about to lose everything he'd spent 8 years building. And the worst part was that he wasn't sure he cared as much as he should, because somewhere between the wedding and tonight, something more important than power had crept into his life, something that felt dangerously like hope. The morning of the Privy Council hearing dawned cold and clear. Cassian dressed in formal black that made him look like death attending its own trial. Serafina wore deep blue silk that transformed her into exactly what they needed her to be. A duchess, a force, a woman capable of standing beside the Iron Duke without flinching. They arrived at Westminster with an escort of 4 guards and the quiet confidence of people who'd already decided they were going to win. Inside, the council chamber was packed, Pemberton and his allies on one side, the nobles Serafina had recruited on the other, and in the center, 12 members of the Privy Council who would decide Cassian's fate. Lord Chancellor Everhart called the session to order with the enthusiasm of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. We are gathered to address concerns regarding the governance of the Northern Territories under Duke Cassian Thornfield. Lord Pemberton has brought allegations of excessive force, tyrannical behavior, and general instability. Duke Thornfield, you stand accused of ruling through fear rather than law. How do you answer? Cassian stood. The room went silent. I answer, he said in a voice that could cut stone, that every action I've taken as Duke of Thornfield has been in service of maintaining order and protecting the Crown's interests in the North. Lord Pemberton's accusations are the desperate lies of a man who attempted to steal from me and failed, who sent assassins to my home and failed, who has now resorted to politics because every other method of destroying me has proven insufficient. Pemberton shot to his feet. You see, this is exactly what I warned you about. Threats, paranoia, the man is unstable. I have evidence. Cassian's voice cut through the room like a blade. Testimony from the assassins Lord Pemberton sent. Financial records showing his attempts to evade legitimate taxes. Correspondence proving his conspiracy with other southern lords to destabilize the Northern Territories. He gestured to Harrow, who stepped forward with documents. Everything is documented. Everything is provable. Lord Pemberton didn't bring me here to answer for crimes. He brought me here hoping you'd strip my title before I could prove his guilt. The chamber erupted in chaos. And in that moment, with evidence spreading across tables and nobles shouting over each other and the Privy Council calling for order, Cassian caught Serafina's eye across the room. She nodded once. They'd just crossed the point of no return. Whatever happened next would determine not just Cassian's fate, but the future of everything they'd begun building together. And there was no going back. The chaos in the council chamber lasted exactly 47 seconds before Lord Chancellor Everhart's gavel cracked against wood like a gunshot, and the room fell silent under the weight of his authority. Cassian remained standing while Pemberton's face cycled through shock and rage, and something darker that looked almost like fear. The documents Harrow had distributed were spreading across tables like poison through water. Financial records, testimony from captured assassins, letters bearing Pemberton's seal discussing strategy with other Southern lords, evidence that had taken weeks to compile and cost 3 men their lives to extract, evidence that should have been enough to end this. But Cassian had been playing this game long enough to know that evidence only mattered if the people judging you wanted to see it. Lord Chancellor Everhart cleared his throat, and the sound carried the weight of a man about to render judgment on something far more complex than simple guilt or innocence. Your evidence is compelling, Duke Thornfield. The accusations against Lord Pemberton appear substantiated. However, this council must consider not merely the facts of this particular dispute, but the larger question of stability in the Northern Territories. The methods you employ to maintain order, the fear your name inspires, the question of whether England benefits from having a duke who rules through violence rather than consensus. Cassian's jaw tightened. They were moving the goalposts. Pemberton had tried to kill him, and the council was still finding ways to make it Cassian's fault. With respect, Lord Chancellor, Cassian said in a voice cold enough to frost glass, the Northern Territories were in chaos when I inherited them at 17. Rebellions every 6 months, trade collapsing, noble houses stealing from each other and from the crown. I restored order. I built systems that work. If my methods seem harsh to comfortable men in London, perhaps those men should spend a winter in the north dealing with lords who only understand strength. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Half agreement, half offense at being called comfortable. Then Seraphina stood. Every eye in the room turned toward her. She was supposed to be decoration, a duchess sitting quietly while men decided her husband's fate. The fact that she was standing at all was a breach of protocol that made several council members frown. Lord Chancellor, if I may speak. Everhart's expression suggested this was highly irregular, but he gestured for her to continue. Seraphina's voice was clear and steady and carried none of the deference these men expected from a woman barely a month into her marriage. I am newly arrived at Thornfield. I have no history with these territories, no investment in the conflicts that predate my marriage. But I have spent the last 3 weeks studying the duchy's records and speaking with its people. And what I've found is not a reign of terror, but a system that functions precisely because it's administered by someone strong enough to enforce fairness. She moved to the center of the chamber. The servants at Thornfield are paid wages above the regional standard. The tenant farmers have long-term leases that protect them from arbitrary eviction. The trade routes my husband secured have brought prosperity to villages that were starving a decade ago. Yes, he rules with a firm hand, but he rules. And the alternative is not gentler governance. It's chaos. Lord Pemberton rose with his face twisted in contempt. You've been his wife for 3 weeks, Lady Seraphina. Forgive me if I don't accept your testimony as impartial. You're defending a man who benefits you personally, who saved your family from bankruptcy. Of course you're going to paint him as some kind of misunderstood hero instead of the tyrant he actually is. Seraphina turned to face Pemberton directly, and her smile could have cut steel. You're right. I do benefit from this marriage. My family was saved from ruin. So forgive me if I don't take moral instruction from a man who tried to solve his problems by hiring assassins. At least my husband's violence is honest. The chamber erupted again. Cassian felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. She was magnificent. This woman who'd entered his life as a transaction was standing in front of England's most powerful men, defending him with the same cold precision he used in battle. She wasn't asking for mercy. She was demanding they acknowledge reality. But reality, Cassian had learned, was negotiable when powerful men wanted it to be. Lord Chancellor Everhart raised his hand for silence. The council will deliberate. Duke Thornfield, Lady Seraphina, you are dismissed until we reach a decision. Lord Pemberton, you will remain to answer questions regarding the evidence presented. Cassian and Seraphina left the chamber together. Neither spoke until they were in the carriage heading back to the townhouse. Then Seraphina exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. Did we win? Cassian stared out the window at London's grey streets. I don't know. The evidence should be enough. But Everhart's comments about methods and stability suggest they're looking for a compromise, something that lets them avoid choosing sides. What kind of compromise? The kind where they censure Pemberton publicly but require me to accept oversight, external audits of the Northern Territories, regular reports to Parliament, constraints on my authority disguised as reform. Serafina was quiet for a moment. Would that be so terrible? Yes. Cassian's voice was flat. Because oversight means delays, committees and approvals and bureaucracy. And in the North, delays get people killed. If I can't respond immediately to threats, the whole system collapses. Then we'll find a way to block it. Cassian turned to look at her. She was exhausted, dark circles under her eyes from weeks of political maneuvering, but her spine was still straight, and her jaw was set with determination. You shouldn't have defended me like that, he said quietly. Not so publicly. If this goes wrong, you've tied yourself to my reputation. They'll judge you by association. Serafina met his eyes. I know. I did it anyway. Why? Because someone needed to tell them the truth, and because I meant what I said. You're not a tyrant. You're a man doing what's necessary in a situation that doesn't allow for softness. They should understand that. They won't. Cassian's expression was grim. Men like Everhart have never had to make the choices I make. They've never stood in a hall at 3 a.m. with a blade in their hand deciding whether someone lives or dies. They think governance is about principle and law. They don't understand that sometimes it's just about surviving until morning. Then teach them. I can't. Cassian's laugh was bitter. That's the whole problem. The gap between what they think power should look like and what it actually requires. There's no bridging that. Serafina reached across the carriage and took his hand. Her fingers were cold. Then maybe we don't need to bridge it. Maybe we just need to survive long enough for them to realize they need you more than you need them. Cassian wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that the evidence would be enough and the truth would matter, and they'd walk away from this with his authority intact. But he'd spent 8 years learning that hope was dangerous, and trust was a liability, and the only thing that kept you alive was being willing to do what your enemies wouldn't. They arrived at the townhouse to find Harrow waiting in the entrance hall with an expression that made Cassian's instincts scream danger. Your Grace, we have a problem. Cassian went very still. What kind of problem? Harrow glanced at Serafina, then back to Cassian. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. No. Cassian's voice was hard. Whatever it is, she needs to hear it. We're past the point of keeping secrets. Harrow's jaw tightened, but he nodded. A letter arrived while you were at Westminster, from Lord Edmund Vale, Serafina's father. Cassian felt her hand tighten on his arm. What does he want? Harrow held out the letter. Cassian took it and broke the seal. The handwriting was shaky and rushed, the kind of writing that came from panic. Your Grace, I must inform you of a grave error. In my desperation to secure my daughter's future, I may have misrepresented certain aspects of my family's situation to you, specifically regarding debts owed to Lord Pemberton's consortium. I believe these debts to be settled through our arrangement. I have since learned they were not. Lord Pemberton is now threatening legal action that could nullify your marriage contract on grounds of fraudulent representation. I am writing to warn you and to beg your forgiveness for any complications this may cause. Your servant, Edmund Vale. The silence in the entrance hall was absolute. Cassian read the letter twice to make sure he understood what he was seeing. Then he looked at Serafina. Her face had gone completely bloodless. Did you know? His voice was quiet. Dangerous. No. Serafina's voice cracked. I knew he had debts. I didn't know they were to Pemberton. I didn't know he'd lied to you about settling them. Cassian's mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating angles and implications. This was the real trap. Not the Privy Council hearing, not the evidence about assassins. This. A legal landmine that could explode their entire strategy. If the marriage contract was signed under false pretenses, it could be annulled, which meant every alliance Serafina had built through her family connections would evaporate. Every testimony from moderate houses that relied on her status as Duchess of Thornfield would become worthless. And Pemberton would walk away from the assassination charges because the primary witness against him would be a disgraced duke married to a woman who'd obtained her title through fraud. It was brilliant, absolutely devastating. And it meant everything they'd built in the last 3 weeks was built on a foundation that never existed. Your Grace, Harrow's voice was careful. What do you want to do? Cassian stared at the letter. He could feel Serafina watching him, waiting to see if he'd blame her for her father's deception, if he'd throw her aside to protect himself, if the ruthless Duke everyone feared would sacrifice his wife the moment she became a liability. The old Cassian would have. The man who'd ruled for 8 years without caring about anything except survival would have ended this marriage immediately and cut his losses. But that version of himself had started dying the night Serafina kissed him and told him he was lying about not caring. "Find Vale," Cassian said flatly. "I want him here, tonight, and get me every contract, every debt record, every piece of paper related to the marriage agreement. If there's a way to fight this, I'm going to find it." Harrow nodded and disappeared. Cassian turned to Serafina. She looked like she was bracing for an execution. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have investigated his finances more carefully. I should have known he'd do something like this. You're not responsible for your father's choices. But I brought this to your door, everything you've built, everything we've worked for. My father just destroyed it with one letter." Cassian crossed the space between them and gripped her shoulders hard enough that she gasped. "Listen to me. Your father's an idiot and a coward, and I'm going to deal with him. But you didn't do this. You didn't lie to me. And I'm not letting Pemberton win because Edmund Vale couldn't manage his own finances." Serafina's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Cassian, if the marriage is annulled, everything falls apart. The coalition, the testimony, your defense. They'll strip your title and redistribute your lands, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. Then we make sure the marriage isn't annulled." "How?" "The contract was signed under false pretenses. That's grounds for nullification under English law. There's no fighting it. There's always a way to fight." Cassian's voice was cold with determination. "I've been fighting since I was 17, and I'm not stopping now, especially not for Pemberton." He released her and turned toward the study. Behind him, Serafina made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "You're insane." "You know that?" Cassian glanced back. "Yes. It's one of my more useful qualities." Lord Edmund Vale arrived at the townhouse 3 hours later looking like a man who'd accepted he was already dead and was just waiting for someone to make it official. He entered the study where Cassian was waiting and immediately dropped to his knees. "Your Grace, please. I never meant for this to happen. I thought the debts were manageable. I thought once the marriage was complete, Pemberton would have no leverage. I was wrong. I'm sorry. I'll do anything to make this right." Cassian stared down at the man who'd sold his daughter to save himself and was now groveling because his scheme had backfired. "Anything." Vale looked up with desperate hope. "Yes, anything. Name it. Stand up." Vale scrambled to his feet. Cassian moved closer until they were nearly nose to nose. His voice was soft and absolutely lethal. "You lied to me. You misrepresented your debts. You put your daughter in a position where her marriage could be invalidated because you were too much of a coward to face Pemberton yourself. And now you're here begging for mercy because you realize that if I go down, you go down with me." Vale was shaking. "Your Grace, Shut up." Cassian's eyes were winter storms. "I don't care about your excuses. I care about fixing this. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to testify before the Privy Council. You're going to admit that you failed to disclose the full extent of your debts to Pemberton. And you're going to state clearly that your daughter had no knowledge of this deception. That she entered this marriage in good faith, but that will ruin me. They'll strip what's left of my estates. I'll lose everything. You already lost everything." Cassian's voice was flat. "The only question is whether you lose it honorably or as a coward who tried to drag his daughter down with him." Vale's face crumpled. "What about Pemberton? He'll use this to destroy you. Let me worry about Pemberton. Your job is to tell the truth for once in your miserable life. Can you do that?" Vale hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. Then he nodded. "Yes." "Your Grace, I'll testify." "Good. Now get out of my sight before I forget I'm trying to be a better man." After Vale left, Serafina emerged from where she'd been listening in the doorway. Her expression was complicated. "You didn't have to protect me like that." Cassian poured himself a drink. "Yes, I did. Why?" She moved closer. "I'm the daughter of the man who just handed Pemberton the weapon he needs to destroy you. You could throw me aside and save yourself. No one would blame you." Cassian downed the drink in one swallow. "I would blame me. That's not a good enough reason." He turned to face her. "Then how about this? You defended me in front of the Privy Council when you had every reason not to. You built alliances I couldn't build. You stood beside me knowing it could cost you everything. And I'm not the kind of man who abandons people who stand with me, even if it costs you your duchy, especially then. Cassian's expression was unreadable, because if I lose everything protecting the one person who actually gave a damn about me, at least I'll know I didn't become the monster everyone thinks I am. Serafina stared at him. Then she crossed the room and kissed him with enough force that they stumbled against the desk. When they finally broke apart, her eyes were fierce. We're not losing. I don't care what Pemberton has planned. I don't care what my father broke. We're going to walk back into that council chamber and we're going to win. Cassian wanted to believe her, but he'd seen the angle Pemberton was playing and it was devastatingly effective. Even with Vale's testimony admitting the debt deception, the damage was done. The marriage contract was compromised. The coalition Serafina built was on shaky ground, and the Privy Council now had the perfect excuse to implement the oversight and constraints they'd wanted all along. They were losing. And for the first time in 8 years, Cassian didn't know how to turn it around. The Privy Council reconvened the next morning with the atmosphere of an execution chamber. News of the debt situation had leaked overnight, and the galleries were packed with nobles who'd come to watch the Iron Duke finally fall. Pemberton sat with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just played his winning card. Vale sat in the witness section looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor, and Cassian stood at the center of it all, with Serafina beside him, knowing that the next hour would determine whether they walked out of this chamber together or if everything he'd built would be torn apart by men who'd never had to fight for anything in their lives. Lord Chancellor Everhart called the session to order with visible reluctance. We have reviewed the evidence regarding Lord Pemberton's alleged conspiracy. We have also been made aware of significant irregularities in the marriage contract between Duke Thornfield and Lady Serafina Vale. Lord Edmund Vale has requested to provide testimony. We will hear from him now. Vale stood on shaking legs and made his way to the witness stand. His voice when he spoke was barely audible. My lords, I come before you to confess my failures. When I approached Duke Thornfield with the proposal of marriage between my daughter and his grace, I failed to disclose the full extent of my debts to Lord Pemberton's consortium. I led the Duke to believe these obligations were manageable when in fact they were substantial. This was dishonest and I take full responsibility. He paused and his voice grew slightly stronger. However, I must state clearly that my daughter Lady Serafina had no knowledge of this deception. She entered her marriage believing all arrangements were legitimate. Any fault lies with me alone, not with her, and not with Duke Thornfield, who acted in good faith throughout. Pemberton rose immediately. This confession proves the marriage contract was signed under fraudulent conditions. The union should be annulled, and any testimony derived from Lady Serafina's status as Duchess should be disregarded. Everhart looked troubled. The irregularities are concerning. However, the question of annulment is complex. The marriage was consummated. Both parties entered it willingly, even if full disclosure was lacking. Dissolving it would require, then let me simplify matters. The voice came from the back of the chamber. Everyone turned. A man Cassian didn't recognize stepped forward from the gallery. He was older, distinguished, dressed in the formal robes of a high court justice. And when he spoke again, his voice carried absolute authority. I am Lord Justice Blackwell of the High Court. I have reviewed the marriage contract between Duke Thornfield and Lady Serafina Vale. I have also reviewed the debt records between Lord Edmund Vale and Lord Pemberton's consortium, and I have found something rather interesting. He produced a document. The debts Lord Vale failed to disclose were indeed owed to a consortium, but that consortium was dissolved 4 months before the marriage contract was signed. The debts were transferred to a new entity, an entity that Lord Pemberton failed to register properly with the Crown's financial office, which means legally those debts don't exist. Which means Lord Vale's failure to disclose them is irrelevant because there was nothing to disclose. The chamber exploded. Cassian's mind raced, trying to understand what had just happened. Someone had investigated Pemberton's financial arrangements deeply enough to find a technicality that invalidated the entire trap. Someone had been working behind the scenes to protect them. But who? Blackwell continued over the chaos. Furthermore, I have evidence that Lord Pemberton knowingly maintained fraudulent financial records for the purpose of manipulating noble marriages and estate transfers. This is a criminal matter that supersedes any questions about Duke Thornfield's governance methods. He turned to face Pemberton directly. Lord Pemberton, you are hereby ordered to appear before the High Court to answer charges of financial fraud, conspiracy, and attempted manipulation of noble contracts. Your estates are frozen pending investigation. Pemberton's face went from confident to gray in seconds. This is absurd. You can't. I can, and I have. Blackwell's expression was iron. Take him into custody. Guards moved forward. Pemberton started shouting about jurisdiction and authority and connections in Parliament, but it didn't matter. He was being dragged from the chamber while the nobles who'd supported him suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Cassian stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. They'd won. Somehow, impossibly, they'd won. The marriage was secure, Pemberton was destroyed, the Northern Territories were safe, but he had no idea how. Everhart gavelled for order, and when the chamber finally quieted, he addressed Cassian with visible relief. Duke Thornfield, in light of these revelations, this council finds no grounds to question your governance of the Northern Territories. The charges brought by Lord Pemberton are dismissed. You are free to return to your duties. He paused. However, I would encourage you to consider the concerns raised about methods and perception. The Crown values stability. Perhaps there are ways to achieve your goals that don't require quite so much fear. Cassian's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I will take that under advisement, Lord Chancellor. It was the most diplomatic thing he'd said in years, and it nearly choked him. After the session ended, Cassian and Seraphina left Westminster in a daze. Neither spoke until they were back in the carriage. Then Seraphina turned to him with wide eyes. What just happened? I have no idea. Cassian was staring out the window. Someone investigated Pemberton's finances. Someone found the technicality that saved us. But I don't know who. Maybe it was one of the houses I recruited. Maybe they... No. Cassian's voice was flat. This was too precise. Too perfectly timed. Someone knew exactly what we needed and delivered it at the exact moment that would have maximum impact. That's not luck. That's planning. Then who? They arrived at the townhouse to find Lord Justice Blackwell waiting in the entrance hall. He stood when they entered, and his expression was unreadable. Your Grace, Lady Seraphina, I believe we need to talk. Cassian's instincts were screaming danger, but he gestured toward the study. After you. Inside, Blackwell declined the offer of a drink and went straight to the point. I imagine you're wondering why I intervened on your behalf. The thought had crossed my mind. Cassian's voice was cold. Since we've never met, and I don't make a habit of having allies I don't know about. Blackwell smiled slightly. You don't have an ally, Your Grace. You have a creditor. Everything in Cassian went very still. Explain. 3 years ago, you crushed a rebellion in the Northern Territories. Among the rebels was a young man named Thomas Ashford. You had him executed. His sister Catherine came to London shortly after and married into my family. She has spent 3 years building a case against you for wrongful execution of her brother. Cassian's blood went cold. Ashford hadn't been wrongful. The man had been organizing an armed insurrection. But legal guilt and political perception were different things. If Blackwell had evidence that could be twisted the right way, it could destroy everything the Privy Council hearing had just saved. So you saved me from Pemberton so you could control me yourself. Blackwell's smile widened. I saved you from Pemberton because having you in my debt is more useful than having you destroyed. My sister-in-law wants justice for her brother. I've convinced her that justice can take many forms. Perhaps a generous annual payment to support her charitable works. Perhaps favorable treatment for certain trade contracts. Perhaps your support on key votes in the House of Lords. He leaned forward. The point, Your Grace, is that you now owe me, and I intend to collect. The silence in the room was suffocating. Cassian felt Seraphina's hand find his under the table. She was trembling with rage, but her voice when she spoke was steady. You orchestrated this entire situation. You let us think we'd won when really you were just positioning yourself to take Pemberton's place. Not at all, Lady Seraphina. Blackwell's voice was pleasant. I simply saw an opportunity to turn a crisis into an arrangement that benefits everyone. You keep your marriage and your reputation. Duke Thornfield keeps his territories. Lord Pemberton faces justice for his actual crimes. And I gain a powerful ally who understands the value of paying his debts. He stood. I'll be in touch with specific requests. I trust you'll be reasonable. After all, the alternative is having Catherine's evidence about the Ashford execution presented to a court that's already questioning your methods. I don't think the Privy Council would be as forgiving a second time. Blackwell left them sitting in the study with the wreckage of their victory scattered around them like broken glass. After a long silence, Serafina spoke. Cassian, we can fight this. We can... No. Cassian's voice was hollow. We can't. He's right. If he brings charges about the Ashford execution, it doesn't matter if I was legally justified. The timing would destroy me. The Privy Council would see it as proof they were wrong to trust me. So you're just going to let him blackmail you after everything? What choice do I have? Cassian stood and walked to the window. I spent 8 years building an empire on the belief that strength was enough. That if I was ruthless enough and feared enough, no one could touch me. But Pemberton touched me. And Blackwell just proved that all my strength meant nothing against someone patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. He turned to face her. His expression was raw with something that looked like defeat. I was wrong, Serafina. About everything. About how power works. About what it takes to survive. I thought I could control everything through force. But all I did was create enemies and build walls. And now those walls are trapping me instead of protecting me. Serafina crossed the room and took his face in her hands. Then maybe it's time to stop building walls. Maybe it's time to figure out who you actually are instead of who you had to become to survive. Cassian's laugh was bitter. You're asking me to change my entire nature. I'm asking you to remember you have a nature beyond survival. Serafina's eyes were fierce. The man who told me to go to bed on our wedding night instead of demanding his rights. The man who defended a 16-year-old servant girl over broken china. The man who just protected me from my father's mistakes, even though it would have been easier to throw me away. That's not cruelty, Cassian. That's not the monster everyone thinks you are. Then what is it? It's the person you could be if you stop believing the only way to win is to make everyone afraid of you. Cassian wanted to believe her, wanted to think that 8 years of building an empire on fear could somehow be transformed into something different, something better. But the reality was staring him in the face. Blackwell had just taken everything Cassian thought he'd won and turned it into a leash. And the only way forward was submission or destruction. For the first time since inheriting his title at 17, Cassian Thornfield felt completely powerless. And the worst part was that he'd done it to himself. Every choice he'd made, every enemy he'd created through ruthlessness instead of diplomacy, every bridge he'd burned because compromise felt like weakness, it had all led to this moment. Standing in a London townhouse with his wife's hands on his face, being told that the only way to survive was to become someone he didn't know how to be. That night, Cassian stood on the townhouse balcony staring at London's endless lights and tried to figure out what came next. Behind him, he could hear Serafina moving through the rooms. She'd spent the evening writing letters to the moderate houses who'd supported them, thanking them, building relationships that might matter if Blackwell decided to collect his debt publicly. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Cassian was still stuck on the fact that he'd lost. The door opened and Serafina joined him in the cold. She was wrapped in a heavy cloak and her breath made small clouds in the darkness. You're going to freeze out here. Good. Maybe it'll help me think. She moved to stand beside him. Have you decided what you're going to do about Blackwell? Cassian was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke in a voice so low it was almost lost in the wind. I'm going to pay him. Whatever he asks. For as long as he asks. Because the alternative is losing everything and I'm not ready to let that happen. Not when I finally have something worth protecting. He turned to look at her. But I'm also going to change. The way I rule. The way I approach problems. The way I deal with enemies. Because Blackwell was right about one thing. Strength alone isn't enough. Not anymore. Maybe it never was. Serafina's eyes were bright. What are you saying? I'm saying you were right. About walls, about fear, about all of it. Cassian's voice was rough. I've spent 8 years building an empire on making people afraid of me. And all it got me was enemies patient enough to wait for me to make one mistake. So maybe it's time to try something different. Like what? I don't know yet. Cassian looked back at the city. But I know I can't keep doing this alone. I know that the woman standing next to me just spent 2 weeks building alliances I never could have made. That she defended me in ways I never could have defended myself. That she's asking me to be better than I am because she actually believes I can be. He took her hand. So I'm going to try. I'm going to figure out how to be the man you think I am instead of the monster everyone else sees. And maybe that'll be enough to survive whatever comes next. Serafina's smile was sad and fierce at the same time. It will be, because we're not doing this alone anymore. We're doing it together. And together means you don't have to carry everything by yourself. Cassian pulled her close, and they stood in the cold while London sprawled beneath them, indifferent to their struggles. Somewhere in that city, Blackwell was planning how to use his new leverage. Somewhere, other enemies were sharpening their knives. Somewhere, the next crisis was already forming. But for the first time in 8 years, Cassian wasn't facing it alone. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. They returned to Thornfield Castle a week later to find the Northern Territories exactly as they'd left them. Functioning. Stable. Maintained by systems Cassian had built with iron and fear. But now, when he looked at his empire, all he could see were the cracks. The places where fear had worked but loyalty would have worked better. The enemies he'd made who could have been allies. The distance between the ruler he'd become and the person he might have been if circumstances had been different. The first thing Cassian did was call a meeting with his senior staff. Harrow, Mrs. Daventry, the captain of the guard, the trade masters who managed commerce, every person who kept Thornfield functioning. He stood before them in the great hall and said something he'd never said before. "I need your help." The words felt like choking, but he forced them out anyway. "I've ruled this duchy for 8 years through strength and control. It's kept us safe. But it's also made enemies I can't keep fighting forever. So I'm asking you now, not ordering, asking. Help me find better ways. Help me build something that lasts beyond fear. Help me become the kind of leader who doesn't need to threaten people to get them to do the right thing." The silence that followed was absolute. These people had served under the Iron Duke. They'd learned to obey without question, and now he was asking them to think, to challenge, to be partners instead of subordinates. Mrs. Daventry spoke first. Her voice was careful but steady. "With respect, Your Grace, what you're describing sounds like weakness. Your enemies will see it as an opening. They'll test you, push boundaries, try to exploit any softness." Cassian nodded. "You're right. They will. So we'll need to be smarter, more strategic. We'll need to build systems that don't require me to personally terrify every potential threat. We'll need allies who stand with us because they want to, not because they're afraid not to." He looked around the room. "I know this isn't what you signed up for. I know you served me because I was strong enough to keep you safe. But strength has limits. I just learned that the hard way. So if you're willing to try something different, I'm asking you to stay. If not, I'll give you references and wish you well. But either way, things are changing. No one left." And slowly, carefully, they began to talk. About systems that relied too heavily on Cassian's personal intervention. About ways to delegate authority without losing control. About building relationships with neighboring duchies that didn't involve threats or intimidation. About allowing servants and tenants to voice concerns without fear of retribution. It was messy and uncomfortable, and went against every instinct Cassian had spent 8 years honing. It was also the hardest thing he'd ever done. Harder than executing rebels. Harder than crushing conspiracies. Harder than standing alone against enemies who wanted him dead. Because survival was simple. You did whatever it took and you didn't apologize. But being better than survival required admitting you'd been wrong. Required changing when change felt like surrender. Required trusting that the people around you might know something you didn't. Required becoming someone new while the old version of yourself screamed that this was weakness and weakness got you killed. That night, Cassian found Serafina in their shared chambers. They'd stopped maintaining separate rooms after London. Stopped pretending this was just a political arrangement. She was reading by the fire and looked up when he entered. "How did it go?" Hard. Cassian sat down heavily. "I have no idea what I'm doing. Everything in me says this is a mistake, that I'm exposing vulnerabilities my enemies will exploit." "Probably." Serafina set down her book. "But you were already vulnerable, Cassian. Pemberton proved that. Blackwell proved that. The only difference now is you're trying to build something stronger than just your reputation. What if it doesn't work? What if I change everything and it falls apart anyway? Then at least you'll know you tried." Serafina moved to sit beside him. "And you won't be wondering for the rest of your life if there was a better way." Cassian pulled her close. 3 months ago, I was the Iron Duke, untouchable, alone, certain I had everything figured out. And now? Now I'm married to a woman who terrifies me more than any enemy I've ever faced. I'm in debt to a man who saved me just to control me. I'm trying to rebuild my entire approach to governance while everyone watches to see if I fail. And I have no idea if any of this is going to work. He kissed her forehead, but for the first time in 8 years, I actually care about something beyond survival. So maybe that's progress. Serafina smiled against his chest. It's definitely progress, even if it doesn't feel like it. They sat together while the fire burned low, and outside Thornfield Castle, the northern territories spread into darkness, lands that Cassian had ruled through fear and iron will, lands that had made him infamous throughout England, lands that he was now trying to govern differently while every instinct screamed that different meant weak and weak meant dead. But Serafina was right. He'd been vulnerable all along. He'd just been too stubborn to see it. And maybe admitting that vulnerability was the first step toward building something that could actually last. Or maybe he was making the biggest mistake of his life. Either way, there was no going back. The Iron Duke who'd ruled alone through fear was gone. In his place was a man trying to figure out who he could become if he stopped believing that strength was the only thing that mattered. A man whose enemies would see that change as weakness and come for him harder than ever before. A man who had finally found something worth fighting for beyond his own survival, and now had to figure out how to protect it without becoming the monster everyone had always believed him to be. The question wasn't whether he could do it. The question was whether he could survive long enough to find out. The first sign that something was wrong came on a February morning when the northern sky turned the color of old bruises and the wind carried smoke from villages that shouldn't have been burning. Cassian was in the stables inspecting new horses when the rider came through the gates at a pace that meant death was close behind. The man nearly fell from his saddle, and Cassian caught him before he hit the ground. Blood soaked through the messenger's coat from a wound in his side that looked like it had been there for hours. "Your Grace?" The man's voice was barely a whisper. "Blackwell. He's coming. With soldiers. Hundreds of them. He says you refused his terms, says you're in rebellion against the crown. They've already taken 3 villages on the eastern border. They're burning everything." Cassian's blood went cold. "I never refused his terms. I've been paying everything he asked." The messenger coughed, and red spattered his lips. "He says different. Says you sent him a letter denying his authority. Says the crown authorized him to seize Thornfield by force if necessary." Cassian's mind raced through the implications. This was a setup. Blackwell had fabricated a refusal that never happened and was using it as justification to invade, which meant the debt he'd been paying for 3 months was never about money. It was about creating the appearance of instability, building a case that Cassian was unreliable, dangerous, a threat that needed to be removed permanently. And now Blackwell was coming with crown authorization to do exactly that. "Where are they now?" Cassian's voice was deadly calm. 2 days out. Maybe less if they push hard. "Your Grace, they're not here to arrest you. They're here to destroy you. Everything. The castle. The lands. Everyone loyal to you." Cassian looked up at Thornfield's towers, at the empire he'd built through blood and iron and 8 years of refusing to break, at the home that Serafina had slowly transformed from a fortress into something that felt almost like a sanctuary, at the future they'd been trying to build where strength didn't require cruelty and power didn't demand isolation. Blackwell was going to burn it all down and claim he was doing it for England. "Get this man to the infirmary." Cassian's voice cut through the chaos that was starting to spread through the courtyard. "Then send runners to every village and outpost. I want everyone who can fight armed and ready. Everyone who can't fight needs to evacuate to the mountains. We have 48 hours. Harrow appeared at his shoulder. "Your Grace, if the crown authorized this, fighting back is treason. We'd be declaring war on England itself. Then we're declaring war." Cassian's eyes were winter storms. "Because I'm done letting men like Blackwell use the law as a weapon while pretending to be civilized. If he wants Thornfield, he's going to have to take it from my corpse." He turned and strode toward the castle. Behind him, the machinery of war began grinding into motion, soldiers pulling weapons from armories, servants boarding up windows, messengers riding out to sound alarms that hadn't been used since the last rebellion 8 years ago. The Iron Duke might have been trying to change, but the world wasn't interested in giving him that chance. So he was going back to what he knew best: survival, defense, making enemies pay in blood for every inch of ground they tried to take. He found Serafina in the library surrounded by maps and ledgers. She looked up when he entered and immediately saw the truth in his face. How bad? Blackwell fabricated a refusal to his terms. He's coming with crown soldiers to seize Thornfield by force. 2 days out, maybe less. Serafina went very still. Can we evacuate? Run somewhere he can't reach? Cassian shook his head. He has crown authorization. Nowhere in England is safe. And if we run, he seizes everything anyway and hunts us down at his leisure. Then we fight. We fight. Cassian moved to the window. But Serafina, if we lose this, it's not just my lands. It's your life, your reputation, everything. Blackwell will make sure neither of us survives this with anything intact. I know. Her voice was steady. I'm staying anyway. Cassian turned to look at her. At this woman who'd entered his life as a transaction and become the only thing he valued more than survival itself. At the Duchess who'd defended him in front of the Privy Council and rebuilt his reputation one careful alliance at a time. At the person who'd made him believe he could be something more than the monster everyone feared. I can't promise we'll win. I don't need promises. Serafina crossed the room until they were face to face. I need you to fight the way you've always fought, with everything you have. No mercy, no hesitation, no second-guessing because you're trying to be better than you are. Her eyes were fierce. You spent 3 months trying to change because I asked you to. But right now, I need the Iron Duke. I need the man who crushed rebellions and made enemies disappear. I need you to be exactly as ruthless as everyone believes you are, because that's the only version of you that survives what's coming. Cassian felt something crack open in his chest. She was giving him permission to become the monster again, to stop trying to be better and just be effective, to embrace every dark instinct he'd been trying to suppress for months because being better meant being vulnerable, and being vulnerable was about to get them both killed. You're sure? I'm sure. Serafina gripped his face hard enough to hurt. Win first, become a better man after, in that order. Cassian kissed her with enough force that they stumbled against the desk. When they broke apart, his voice was rough. If we survive this, I'm never letting you go. You understand that? Never. Not for anything. Good. Because I wasn't planning on leaving. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation that felt like standing at the edge of an abyss and counting down to the fall. Cassian fortified every approach to the castle. He positioned archers on towers and swordsmen at choke points. He armed every person who could hold a weapon and evacuated everyone who couldn't. He moved through his territory like a man preparing to defend his tomb, because that's exactly what this was. His last stand. The moment when 8 years of building an empire through fear and strength would either prove sufficient or collapse under the weight of a man patient enough to wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. On the second night, he stood on the battlements with Harrow reviewing their defenses one final time. Below, torches moved through the darkness as soldiers took up positions. The northern territories that had feared him for years were now preparing to fight beside him, not because they loved him, but because Blackwell represented something worse. An outsider coming to seize lands that weren't his, an opportunist using crown authority as cover for theft. They were defending their homes as much as their duke, and maybe that was enough. We're as ready as we're going to be. Harrow's voice was grim. But your grace, if they have crown authorization, they'll have artillery, cannons, siege equipment we can hold for a week, maybe 2 if we're lucky. But eventually they'll break through. Cassian stared out at the darkness where somewhere beyond the horizon, Blackwell's army was approaching. I know, so we make every day cost him. We make him pay in blood for every wall he takes. We make this so expensive that even if he wins, the crown questions whether it was worth the price. And if that's not enough, then we die here. Cassian's voice was flat. But at least we die on our feet. Harrow was quiet for a long moment. It's been an honor serving you, your grace. Whatever happens tomorrow. Cassian glanced at his steward. This man had stood beside him through rebellions and conspiracies and 8 years of barely controlled chaos. Had executed orders without question, even when those orders were brutal. Had never once suggested that maybe the Iron Duke was wrong about how to rule. The honor was mine, Harrow. You deserved a better lord than what I was. Maybe in the next life, you'll get one. Before Harrow could respond, a horn sounded from the eastern watchtower. 3 long blasts that meant only one thing. The enemy was here. Cassian's hand went to his sword. Apparently we don't get 2 days. They pushed hard. He turned toward the stairs. Get everyone to positions. No one fires until I give the order. And Harrow, make sure Lady Serafina is in the inner keep. If they break through, she needs to be as far from the fighting as possible. Your Grace, she's not going to agree to that. I don't care if she agrees. Keep her safe. That's an order. Cassian descended the stairs 3 at a time and emerged into a courtyard transformed into a war zone. Soldiers everywhere, weapons gleaming in torchlight. The air thick with tension and the kind of fear that came from knowing you were about to face something larger and better equipped than anything you'd trained for. These were farmers and craftsmen who'd learned to fight because the northern territories required it. They weren't professional soldiers. They were people defending their homes against an army that represented everything they'd spent years resisting. But they were here, and that had to count for something. Cassian mounted the wall and looked out at the darkness beyond. For a long moment there was nothing, just wind and smoke and the distant sound of something massive moving through the night. Then torches appeared on the horizon, hundreds of them, thousands. A river of fire advancing toward Thornfield like a judgment that could not be appealed or delayed. At the center of that river, Cassian could make out banners bearing the crown's colors, and below them, Blackwell's personal standard. The man himself rode at the front of his army wearing armor that probably cost more than most of these soldiers would earn in a lifetime. He looked confident, comfortable, like he'd already won, and this was just the formality of collecting what he was owed. Cassian felt rage settle into his bones like ice. He'd spent 3 months paying this man, 3 months trying to build something different than fear. 3 months believing that maybe there was a way forward that didn't require becoming a monster. And Blackwell had used every second of that time to build the case that would justify destroying everything Cassian cared about. There was a lesson in that. About trust. About trying to be better in a world designed to punish anything that looked like weakness. About how men who wore morality like armor were often more dangerous than the ones who admitted they were monsters. The lesson was simple. Being good got you killed. Being strong kept you alive. And Cassian had forgotten that for just long enough to give Blackwell the opening he needed. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Blackwell's army stopped just outside arrow range. A rider approached carrying a white flag and a scroll. Cassian watched him come and felt the bitter satisfaction of knowing exactly what that scroll would say. An offer of terms. A chance to surrender. Proof that Blackwell was being reasonable, and Cassian was the unreasonable one for refusing. The rider stopped at the base of the wall and called up in a voice trained to carry. Duke Thornfield, Lord Justice Blackwell offers you one final opportunity to surrender peacefully. Yield your title and estates to Crown authority. Submit to arrest and trial for crimes against the realm. Do this, and your people will be spared. Your wife will be granted safe passage to her family. Refuse, and everything you've built will be reduced to ash. Cassian leaned over the wall. His voice, when he spoke, was cold enough to freeze blood. Tell Blackwell I have a counteroffer. Turn his army around and leave my lands. Do this before sunrise, and I'll let him keep his head. Refuse, and I'll mount it on a spike as a reminder to every ambitious bastard in England what happens when you come for Thornfield. The rider's face went pale. Your Grace, these are crowned soldiers. Attacking them is treason. I know exactly what it is. Cassian's smile was the kind that made smart men run. Now deliver my message before I decide you're wasting my time. The rider fled back toward Blackwell's lines. Cassian watched him go and felt the last piece of the man he'd been trying to become crumble away. He'd tried. For 3 months, he'd genuinely tried to be something more than the Iron Duke. To rule through respect instead of fear. To build alliances instead of crushing enemies. To believe that maybe England could accept a version of him that wasn't defined entirely by violence. But England wasn't interested. Blackwell wasn't interested. The world Cassian lived in rewarded strength and punished anything that looked like mercy. So he was done trying to be what they wanted. Done pretending that being better would save him. Done believing that there was any path forward except the one he'd always known. He was going to fight. And he was going to make Blackwell regret every second of the patience that had brought him to this moment. Beside him, Seraphina appeared despite Harrow's orders to keep her in the inner keep. She wore riding clothes and had a knife strapped to her hip. When Cassian turned to confront her, she held up a hand. Don't. I'm not going to the inner keep. I'm not hiding while you fight for our lives. So save your breath and tell me what you need me to do. Cassian stared at her. At this woman who'd somehow become more important than survival itself. At the Duchess, who should have been safe in London instead of standing on a wall waiting for an army to tear her world apart. At the only person in 8 years who'd looked at him and seen something worth saving. You're insane. I know. Seraphina's smile was sharp. I married you, didn't I? Despite everything, Cassian almost laughed. Stay behind the front line. If they break through, you run. You don't fight. You don't try to be heroic. You run, And you don't look back. Promise me. Serafina's expression was unreadable. I promise I'll do what needs to be done. That's the only promise I can make. It wasn't what Cassian wanted to hear, but it was the truth. And truth was all they had left. He pulled her close and kissed her hard enough to bruise. When they broke apart, his voice was rough. If we survive this, I'm taking you somewhere far away from England and its politics and men like Blackwell. Somewhere no one knows my name or cares about Northern Territories. And we're going to figure out who we actually are when we're not fighting for our lives. I'd like that. Serafina touched his face. But first we have to survive. First we have to survive. The attack came at dawn when the sky was gray and the light was weak and visibility was bad enough that Blackwell's soldiers could advance under cover of morning fog. Cassian heard them before he saw them, the sound of boots on frozen ground, the creak of siege ladders being carried forward, the shouted orders of officers positioning their forces for the assault. Then the arrows started falling, hundreds of them, thousands, a black rain that hammered against shields and walls and found gaps in armor with devastating efficiency. Cassian's archers returned fire, but they were outnumbered 5-1, and their arrows disappeared into Blackwell's formations like drops in an ocean. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution, an overwhelming force crushing resistance through sheer numerical superiority. The first ladder hit the wall near the eastern gate. Cassian was there before the first soldier reached the top. His sword took the man's head off, and the body tumbled backward, taking 3 more soldiers with it. But another ladder went up, then another, then 5 more. They were coming from every direction at once, and Cassian's people were spread too thin to hold them all. He moved through the fighting like death itself, every strike calculated, every motion efficient. He'd learned to fight in wars that didn't allow for mistakes, and he'd perfected the skill through years of putting down rebellions. His blade found throats and hearts, and the gaps in armor where men were vulnerable. Around him, his soldiers fought with the desperate ferocity of people defending their homes. They weren't trained, they weren't professional, but they were angry, and that made them dangerous. For 2 hours they held. Then Blackwell brought up the artillery. The first cannonball hit the eastern wall, and the entire castle shook. Stone exploded inward, and 3 of Cassian's soldiers disappeared in the blast. The second shot hit the same spot, and suddenly there was a breach, a gap in the wall wide enough for 10 men to pour through at once. Blackwell's soldiers saw the opening and charged. Cassian tried to get there first, but he was too far away, and there were too many enemies between him and the breach. He watched helplessly as crown soldiers flooded through the gap into Thornfield's courtyard. This was it. The moment when 8 years of building an empire through strength finally proved insufficient against someone patient enough to wait for the perfect opening. Cassian had known this was coming, had known that eventually someone would figure out how to beat him. He'd just hoped he'd have more time, hoped that the changes he'd been trying to make would somehow matter, hoped that being better would count for something in the final accounting. But hope was a luxury for people who weren't about to die defending walls that couldn't hold. He fought his way toward the breach, cutting through enemies with the efficiency of a man who'd given up on surviving and was now focused entirely on making his death expensive. Blood covered his armor, his lungs burned, his sword arm ached from the weight of bodies he'd put down. Around him, Thornfield's defenders were being pushed back inch by inch. They were losing, slowly but inevitably losing. And there was nothing Cassian could do except keep fighting until someone got lucky and put a blade where his armor didn't cover. Then he saw Blackwell. The man had entered through the breach surrounded by personal guards. He was directing the assault with the calm efficiency of someone who'd already won. When his eyes met Cassian's across the chaos, he smiled. Not with triumph, with satisfaction, like he was watching a problem solve itself, and all he had to do was wait for the conclusion. Cassian felt something primal surge through him, something that lived deeper than strategy or calculation. This man had orchestrated everything, had saved him just to control him, had fabricated crimes to justify invasion, had brought an army to destroy everyone and everything Cassian cared about, all because Cassian had dared to try being something other than a monster. He started moving toward Blackwell with single-minded focus. Enemies got in his way, and he cut them down without slowing. Arrows whistled past his head, and he didn't flinch. A sword opened a gash across his ribs, and he barely felt it. His entire world had narrowed to one objective: get to Blackwell. End this. Make the man who'd orchestrated his destruction understand exactly what it cost to back the Iron Duke into a corner with nothing left to lose. Blackwell saw him coming, and his smile widened. He said something to his guards, and they moved to intercept. 6 professional soldiers in full armor with fresh weapons and no injuries, against a duke who'd been fighting for hours and was bleeding from a dozen wounds, against a man who should have been exhausted and slow and easy to finish. Cassian went through them like they were made of paper. The first guard's throat opened before he understood the danger. The second took a blade through the eye. The third and fourth died so close together they fell in a pile. The fifth hesitated, and that hesitation cost him his life. The sixth actually got his sword up to block, but Cassian's counterstrike shattered the man's wrist, and his follow-through opened the guard from shoulder to hip. Then it was just Cassian and Blackwell with 6 bodies between them, and the sounds of battle raging in every direction. Blackwell's smile had finally disappeared. "You're insane, Thornfield. You can't win this. Even if you kill me, my army will tear you apart." Cassian's voice was dead calm. "I know, but you'll be gone, and that's all that matters." He attacked. Blackwell was better than Cassian expected. The man had clearly trained with real weapons masters, instead of just buying his way into authority. His blade moved with precision, and his footwork was solid. For 30 seconds they fought while the battle raged around them, and neither could gain advantage. Then Cassian saw the opening, a fraction of a second where Blackwell's guard dropped half an inch. He drove his blade forward and felt it sink into flesh. Blackwell gasped and stumbled backward. Blood poured from the wound in his side. Not immediately fatal, but bad enough. He looked down at the injury with something like disbelief. Then his eyes found Cassian's. "This changes nothing. You're still finished. The crown will hunt you to the ends of the earth for killing one of their justices." Cassian stepped closer. His sword was still dripping with Blackwell's blood. "I know, but I'll die knowing I took you with me. And that's worth more than survival ever was." He raised his blade for the killing strike. A scream cut through the courtyard, a woman's scream. Cassian's head snapped around and his heart stopped. Serafina was being dragged toward the breach by 3 of Blackwell's soldiers. She was fighting like a wild thing, kicking, biting, refusing to go quietly. But they had her arms pinned, and she was outnumbered, and they were pulling her away from the castle toward whatever fate Blackwell had planned for her. Cassian's world tilted. For 8 years he'd made decisions based on cold calculation. What protected his lands? What maintained his power? What kept him alive? He'd sacrificed relationships and reputation and any possibility of being seen as something other than a monster because survival required it, and survival was all that mattered. But watching the only person who'd ever made him want to be better than survival getting dragged away by enemies who would use her to break him, Cassian understood the fundamental flaw in how he'd built his empire. You couldn't survive your way to a life worth living. You couldn't calculate your way to meaning. You couldn't protect yourself so completely that nothing could hurt you because the things worth having were exactly the things that made you vulnerable. And Serafina was the thing that made him most vulnerable of all. Which meant she was also the thing he couldn't lose. Not for his lands, not for his reputation, not even to finish the enemy who'd orchestrated all of this. Cassian turned away from Blackwell and ran toward Serafina. Behind him, Blackwell shouted for his guards. Around him, the battle continued with desperate intensity. In front of him, the soldiers holding Serafina saw him coming and started moving faster toward the breach and the army waiting beyond. Cassian pushed his exhausted body harder than it had ever been pushed. His lungs burned, his wounds screamed. His vision narrowed to a tunnel that contained only Serafina and the enemies between them. He reached the first soldier and his blade opened the man's spine. The second soldier turned to fight and died with Cassian's sword through his chest. The third one holding Serafina tried to use her as a shield, but she slammed her head backward into his face, and when he staggered, Cassian's blade found his throat. Serafina collapsed, and Cassian caught her. For one brief moment, they were together in the middle of chaos, breathing hard, covered in blood and dirt, alive against all probability. "You're an idiot." Serafina's voice was shaking. "You had him. You could have ended this. I couldn't lose you. So you let him live? So he can finish destroying us." Cassian pulled her close. "Yes, because you're worth more than revenge, more than my empire, more than survival itself. And I'd rather die with you beside me than live forever knowing I chose wrong." Serafina's eyes were wet. "You really are insane." "I know." Cassian kissed her forehead. "But I'm your insanity, and that has to count for something." Around them, the fighting was reaching a crescendo. Thornfield's defenders were being pushed back toward the inner keep. The courtyard was full of Blackwell's soldiers. The walls were falling, and somewhere in the chaos, Blackwell himself was still alive and still commanding the army that was tearing everything apart. They were losing. Completely and inevitably losing. But Cassian had Seraphina, and that meant he hadn't lost everything. Not yet. Not while they were still breathing. "Can you fight?" Seraphina picked up a fallen sword. "Try and stop me." They moved back toward the inner keep together, fighting as a unit, covering each other's weaknesses, moving with the synchronization of people who understood each other completely. Around them, what remained of Thornfield's defenders rallied. They formed a defensive line at the inner keep's entrance. It was a last stand, a final defiant gesture before the inevitable end. But it was their stand, their choice, their refusal to go quietly into whatever darkness Blackwell had planned. And maybe that was enough. Maybe dying on your feet with the person you loved beside you was better than surviving alone in a world where strength was the only currency that mattered. Maybe the real failure wasn't losing the fight. It was never finding something worth fighting for beyond your own survival. Cassian had spent 8 years building an empire on fear and control. And in 3 months, one woman had taught him that everything he'd built meant nothing compared to having someone who actually gave a damn whether you lived or died. He was about to lose his lands, his title, probably his life. But he'd gained something infinitely more valuable. He'd gained the certainty that he wasn't alone, that someone stood with him by choice instead of fear, that when the end came, he wouldn't face it as the Iron Duke that England feared, but as a man who'd learned too late that being human was worth more than being invincible. Blackwell's soldiers massed for a final push, hundreds of them facing maybe 30 defenders who were exhausted and wounded and out of time. This was it, the last moment, the final breath before everything collapsed. Cassian raised his sword and prepared to meet death with the same cold efficiency he'd used to meet everything else. Then the horn sounded from the northern watchtower, a different horn, not the warning blast that meant enemies approaching, the complicated pattern that meant something else entirely, something Cassian hadn't heard in 8 years because it hadn't been necessary in that long. Reinforcements. Cassian's head snapped toward the northern gate, and what he saw made his breath catch. Riders pouring through the darkness. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Flying colors from a dozen different houses. All the moderate nobles Seraphina had recruited during the Privy Council hearing. All the Midlands families who'd testified on his behalf. All the people who'd been watching from the shadows waiting to see which way the wind would blow. They'd chosen, and they'd chosen Thornfield. At the front of the relief force rode a man Cassian recognized immediately. Lord Ashworth. The same nobleman Seraphina had convinced to testify 3 months ago. His voice carried across the courtyard with aristocratic authority. "Lord Justice Blackwell, you are hereby ordered to stand down. These lands are under the protection of a coalition of Midland houses who dispute the Crown's authority to seize them without proper trial. Any further aggression will be met with force." Blackwell's face went from confident to gray in seconds. This was his nightmare scenario. A coalition large enough to challenge Crown authority. Witnesses who would testify that his seizure was illegal. Political pressure that would force Parliament to investigate instead of simply accepting his version of events. He'd gambled that Thornfield would stand alone, that no one would risk defending the Iron Duke, and Seraphina had just proved him catastrophically wrong. The battle stopped. Not all at once, but gradually as soldiers on both sides realized the situation had fundamentally changed. Blackwell's army was still larger, but they were exhausted from fighting and now facing fresh forces who had every legal justification to attack. If they continued, it wouldn't be a simple suppression of a rebellious duke. It would be a civil war between noble coalitions. And civil wars had a way of destroying everyone involved regardless of who technically won. Blackwell stared across the courtyard at Cassian with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Thornfield. I'll find another way. Another angle. You can't hide behind coalitions forever." Cassian's expression was carved from stone. "I'm not hiding. I'm surviving. And every day I survive is another day you failed. Remember that. When you're explaining to the Crown why your authorized seizure turned into a political disaster." He turned away from Blackwell and walked towards Seraphina. Around them, the defenders of Thornfield were staring at the relief force with expressions somewhere between disbelief and exhausted gratitude. They'd survived. Against all probability. Against overwhelming odds. against a justice backed by crown authority and an army that should have crushed them in hours. They'd survived because one woman had spent 3 months building alliances that everyone, including Cassian, had thought were just political theater. Because Serafina had understood something the Iron Duke never could. That strength wasn't just about being feared. It was about being worth defending, about building relationships that made people choose your side even when choosing was dangerous. She'd saved them. Not through violence or intimidation, but through the kind of careful diplomatic work that Cassian had always dismissed as weakness. She'd proven that there was more than one way to win, more than one kind of power, more than one path to survival, and she'd done it while Cassian was busy being exactly the monster everyone expected. He found her leaning against the wall, breathing hard with blood on her clothes and exhaustion in her eyes. When she saw him approaching, she managed a weak smile. "Told you we wouldn't lose." Cassian pulled her into his arms and held her like she might disappear if he let go. "You're terrifying. You know that?" "I know." Serafina's voice was muffled against his chest. "I learned from the best." They stood together while around them Blackwell's army reluctantly withdrew and the coalition forces secured the grounds, and what remained of Thornfield's defenders collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to even celebrate. The eastern wall was rubble. The courtyard was full of bodies. The castle that had stood for 3 centuries looked like something out of a nightmare. But they were alive. Against every expectation, against every logical calculation of odds and forces, they were alive. And somewhere in the ruins of what had almost been their tomb, Cassian Thornfield understood that he'd just been given something he didn't deserve and had never earned, a second chance. Not to be the Iron Duke, not to rule through fear, but to become whatever he could be with Serafina beside him, whatever came next. If they could survive that long, if Blackwell didn't find another way to destroy them, if the Crown didn't decide that a duke who'd fought against their authorized justice was too dangerous to leave in power, if the coalition that had saved them today didn't decide tomorrow that Thornfield was more trouble than it was worth. Too many variables, too many threats, too many enemies who would spend years plotting revenge for this failure. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. And Cassian had no idea how to win a war where strength alone wasn't enough, and being better required skills he'd never learned. But looking at Serafina's face, at the woman who'd stood beside him through everything, who'd defended him when he didn't deserve it, who'd built alliances while he was busy being a monster, who'd just saved his life by being exactly what he wasn't. Cassian thought maybe, just maybe, he could figure it out. If she gave him enough time, if the world gave them both enough time, if whatever came next didn't kill them before they had a chance to become whoever they were supposed to be. The silence after battle was always worse than the battle itself. Cassian stood in what remained of Thornfield's courtyard, while dawn broke over ruins that 3 days ago had been impregnable walls and now looked like the kind of devastation that took generations to rebuild. Bodies everywhere. His people and Blackwell's soldiers tangled together in death with no meaningful distinction between them anymore. Blood soaked into frozen ground, smoke still rising from buildings that had burned during the fighting. And everywhere, the survivors moving through the wreckage with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of people who'd looked at death for hours and somehow were still breathing. This was victory. This was what winning looked like when you fought with everything you had and barely survived. And standing in the middle of it, Cassian felt something fundamental shift inside him. Some piece of certainty that had held him together for 8 years finally cracking under the weight of what it had cost to defend the empire he'd built on fear and iron will. He'd won. Serafina's coalition had saved them. Blackwell had retreated. The northern territories were still his, but the price was written in the faces of widows searching for husbands among the dead, in children who'd lost fathers defending walls that shouldn't have needed defending, in the realization that every choice he'd made for 8 years had led inevitably to this moment, to carnage, to loss, to the understanding that being strong enough to hold power didn't mean being wise enough to wield it. Your Grace. Harrow's voice pulled Cassian back from thoughts that were spiraling toward places he couldn't afford to go. His steward looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight, blood on his clothes, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, but alive, still standing, still functional despite everything. Casualty count? Harrow's expression was bleak. 43 dead. Another 60 wounded badly enough they might not make it. We lost the entire eastern wall. The armory is destroyed. The grain stores burned. It'll take years to rebuild what we lost in 3 hours. And Blackwell's forces retreated to the southern border. Lord Ashworth's coalition is shadowing them to make sure they actually leave. But Your Grace, this isn't over. Blackwell will regroup. He'll find another angle. And next time we might not have a coalition to save us. Cassian knew Harrow was right. This was a reprieve, not a resolution. Blackwell had failed, but he was still alive. Still influential, still connected to power structures that could authorize another attempt whenever the political winds shifted. And the crown wouldn't forget that one of their justices had been humiliated by a duke they already considered dangerously independent. Cassian had won the battle, but he'd also painted a target on his back that would never fully disappear. The thought should have terrified him. A week ago, it would have sent him spiraling into contingency planning and threat assessment and all the mechanisms he'd developed to control outcomes through sheer force of will. But standing in ruins while the sun rose over devastation that bore his name, Cassian felt something different than fear. He felt tired. Bone-deep tired. The kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long, and finally understanding that strength alone would never be enough. That he could fight and win and defend and survive, but it would just lead to more fights and more defenses and more moments like this where victory looked indistinguishable from defeat. There had to be a different way. A path that didn't require defending everything with violence. A future that looked less like an endless siege and more like something worth protecting. But finding that path meant becoming someone fundamentally different than the Iron Duke who'd ruled through fear for 8 years. It meant admitting that the man he'd been wasn't who he needed to be. And that admission felt like dying. Maybe it was dying. Maybe the person he'd been had to die so someone better could take his place. The question was whether he had the courage to let that death happen, or if he'd cling to familiar cruelty because it was the only thing he knew how to do well. "Find Lady Seraphina." Cassian's voice was rough. "Tell her I need to speak with her. And Harrow, start coordinating the rebuilding. Whatever people need, food, shelter, medical supplies, take it from my personal reserves if necessary. No one who fought for Thornfield goes hungry or cold while I still have resources." Harrow's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise. "Your Grace, if you empty your reserves now, you'll have nothing left for emergencies." "This is the emergency." Cassian met his steward's eyes. "These people bled for me. The least I can do is make sure they don't suffer for it." After Harrow left, Cassian walked through the ruins alone. He needed to see it, needed to understand the full scope of what his choices had wrought. Every broken wall, every burned building, every body being carried away for burial. This was his responsibility, his failure to find a better way, his inability to build something that didn't require constant defense against enemies he'd created through his own ruthlessness. He found Seraphina in what remained of the library. She was standing amid shelves that had collapsed, books scattered like casualties across the floor. And she was crying. Not loud sobs, just tears running down her face while she held a ruined volume that had probably been in Thornfield's collection for centuries and was now destroyed because Cassian hadn't been smart enough to avoid this war. When she heard his footsteps, she turned. Her face was streaked with ash and blood and exhaustion, but her eyes were clear. "How many?" 43 dead so far. "More coming," Cassian's voice was flat. "We won, but it doesn't feel like winning." Seraphina set down the ruined book carefully. "That's because it wasn't victory, it was survival. And survival is what you do when all the better options are already gone." She crossed the space between them, and Cassian saw that she was shaking. Not from fear, from rage, from the accumulated weight of 3 months spent trying to build something better, only to watch it nearly destroyed by a man who'd been patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. "I built that coalition to protect you," she said quietly. "I called in every favor, made promises I'm not sure I can keep, convinced moderate houses that you were worth defending. And it worked. We survived. But Cassian, we can't do this again. We can't keep living like we're under siege. We can't build a future when we're constantly fighting for the present." "I know. Then what are we going to do? Because I didn't marry the Iron Duke just to watch him die defending walls that can't hold. I married a man who I thought could become something more than fear and strength. But if you can't figure out how to be that man, we're just going to keep having this conversation until one of us doesn't survive the next attack." Her voice broke on the last words. Cassian felt something in his chest tear open. This woman had saved his life, had defended him when he didn't deserve it, had built alliances while he was busy being a monster, and now she was asking him to be someone he didn't know how to be. Someone who solved problems without violence, someone who built instead of defending, someone worthy of the future she was trying to create. He didn't know if he could do it, didn't know if 8 years of being the Iron Duke could be undone by good intentions and desperate hope. But looking at Serafina's face, at the tears cutting tracks through ash, Cassian understood that he had to try. Not because he believed he'd succeed, but because the alternative was losing the only person who'd ever made him want to be better than survival. "I'm going to London," he said quietly. "I'm going to the Crown, and I'm going to negotiate terms." Serafina's eyes widened. Terms? Oversight, audits, external review of how I govern the Northern Territories. Everything I've spent 8 years avoiding because I thought it was weakness. I'm going to accept it, all of it. Because you're right, we can't keep fighting, and the only way to stop fighting is to prove I'm not the threat they think I am. Cassian, they'll use that oversight to undermine you, to limit your authority, to slowly strip away everything you've built. I know. His voice was steady. But what I've built isn't worth keeping if it requires this. If it requires watching people die defending walls against enemies I created. If it requires you crying in a ruined library because I couldn't find a better way. He took her hands. They were cold and covered in ash. I spent 8 years being strong enough to hold power. Now I need to figure out if I'm strong enough to share it. To trust that England might actually accept a version of me that isn't defined entirely by violence. And if they don't, if they use oversight as a weapon to destroy me anyway, at least I'll know I tried something different. Serafina stared at him. This is insane. You're gambling everything on the possibility that the Crown will be merciful, that Parliament won't see oversight as an opportunity to dismantle the Northern Territories piece by piece. Yes. Cassian's smile was bitter. I'm gambling that being better actually matters, that trying to change is worth more than staying the same. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm throwing away 8 years of work on the hope that England will give me a chance to be something other than a monster. But Serafina, I'd rather fail trying to be better than succeed at being what I've always been. The silence between them was heavy with implications. They were standing at a crossroads. One path led to continuing the siege mentality, building higher walls, making more enemies, fighting until they finally lost. The other path led into unknown territory where strength wasn't enough, and being better required vulnerability that could be weaponized against them. Both paths were terrifying, but only one path led somewhere that looked like a future worth having. I'll come with you. Serafina's voice was steady. To London. To the negotiations, whatever you need. But Cassian, if we do this, we do it together. No more making decisions alone. No more carrying everything by yourself. We're partners or we're nothing. Partners. Cassian tested the word. It felt foreign in his mouth. He'd been alone for so long that partnership seemed like weakness. But maybe that was exactly why he'd ended up here. In ruins, surrounded by bodies, fighting wars that could only end badly because he'd never learned how to let anyone stand beside him as an equal. Partners, he agreed. Even when I'm terrible at it. Even when every instinct I have screams that sharing power is suicide. Even when I want to make unilateral decisions because it's faster and cleaner and I know I'm right. Especially then. Serafina's smile was small but real, because that's when you need someone to stop you from being the monster everyone thinks you are. They left for London 3 days later after organizing the rebuilding and burying the dead and ensuring that Thornfield's remaining defenders had everything they needed. The journey took 5 days through late winter cold, and Cassian spent most of it trying to prepare for conversations he'd avoided for 8 years. How to explain to the Crown that he wanted oversight without looking weak. How to request limitations on his authority without inviting exploitation. How to negotiate terms that would satisfy Parliament's concerns without gutting the Northern Territory's ability to function. It was the kind of political maneuvering he'd always dismissed as weakness, and now his survival depended on learning how to do it well. Serafina coached him during the journey, teaching him the language of diplomacy, how to frame concessions as cooperation, how to make limitations sound like improvements, how to present himself as a duke who wanted to modernize governance rather than a tyrant being forced to accept constraints. It was exhausting work. Every instinct Cassian had screamed against the subtlety and careful phrasing. He wanted to tell the Crown exactly what he thought and let them deal with his bluntness. But bluntness had led to Blackwell nearly destroying everything. So he bit his tongue and learned and tried to become someone capable of winning fights that didn't involve swords. They arrived in London to find the city buzzing with rumors about the confrontation at Thornfield. Some stories painted Cassian as a hero who defended his lands against an overzealous justice. Others portrayed him as a dangerous rebel who'd attacked crown forces. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative. And that complexity was exactly what Cassian needed to exploit if he wanted to survive what came next. Lord Chancellor Everhard agreed to meet within 2 days. The same man who'd presided over the Privy Council hearing 3 months ago. The same official who'd expressed concern about Cassian's methods and suggested that maybe gentler governance was possible. He would be either Cassian's ally in this negotiation or the person who authorized his destruction. There was no middle ground. The meeting took place in Everhart's private study rather than the formal council chamber. It was a deliberate choice, more intimate, less official, a signal that this conversation was about finding solutions rather than rendering judgment. Cassian took that as a positive sign, even as his instincts screamed that it might be a trap. Everhart was a thin man in his 60s with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much political violence to be surprised by anything. He offered wine that Cassian declined and then got straight to the point. "You've created quite the mess, Thornfield. Blackwell claims you attacked Crown forces without provocation. You claim he fabricated charges to justify seizing your lands. Both stories have evidence supporting them. Both stories make England look weak and divided. So I'm going to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. What do you want?" Cassian met the Lord Chancellor's eyes. He'd prepared for this moment. Rehearsed the diplomatic language. Practiced the careful phrasing that would make his request sound reasonable instead of desperate. But sitting across from a man who held his future in tired hands, all that preparation evaporated. And what came out was truth instead of strategy. "I want to stop being the Iron Duke. I want to govern the Northern Territories in a way that doesn't require constant violence. I want oversight and accountability and all the things I've spent 8 years avoiding because I thought they were weakness. And I want the Crown to give me a chance to prove that trying to be better isn't just a ploy to avoid consequences." The silence that followed was absolute. Everhart stared at him with an expression Cassian couldn't read. Finally, the Lord Chancellor spoke. "That's either the most honest thing I've heard from a duke in 30 years or the most sophisticated manipulation attempt I've ever encountered. I'm not sure which." "It's honest." Cassian's voice was rough. "I'm tired. I'm exhausted from fighting and defending and making enemies faster than I can eliminate them. I thought strength was enough. I thought if I was ruthless enough, I could control everything. But I was wrong. And that mistake almost cost me everything I care about. So I'm here asking for a different way forward, even if that way makes me vulnerable, even if it costs me power." Everhart leaned back in his chair. His expression was thoughtful. "You understand that accepting oversight means limitations. Audits of your finances, external review of major decisions, regular reports to Parliament. Your authority would be constrained in ways that might make governing difficult." "I understand. And you understand that there are nobles in London who will see those constraints as weakness, who will test your boundaries, push against the limits, try to exploit any opening you give them." "I understand that too." Cassian's jaw tightened. "But Lord Chancellor, the alternative is continuing what I've been doing. And that path leads to more battles like the one 3 days ago. More bodies, more ruins, more enemies waiting for the perfect moment to destroy me. I can't keep living like that. And England shouldn't want me to." Everhart was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and moved to the window overlooking London's grey streets. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone making a decision that would ripple through decades. "I'm going to propose something to Parliament. A probationary arrangement. You accept oversight for 5 years. External audits, regular reviews, limitations on your authority to unilaterally punish or reward. In exchange, the Crown drops any investigation into the Blackwell incident and acknowledges that both sides bear responsibility for the escalation. At the end of 5 years, if your governance has improved and you've demonstrated the ability to work within constraints, the oversight gets reduced. If not, it becomes permanent." He turned to face Cassian. "It's not generous. It's not what you deserve after defending your lands against an unjust seizure. But it's what I can sell to Parliament. And it's the best chance you have at a future that doesn't involve constant warfare." Cassian felt something loosen in his chest. This was it. The moment when he either committed to becoming someone different or walked away and continued being the Iron Duke until enemies or age or exhaustion finally killed him. There was no guarantee this would work. No promise that accepting oversight wouldn't just give his enemies the tools to dismantle everything he'd built. But standing in Everhart's study with Serafina waiting downstairs and Thornfield in ruins behind him, Cassian understood that guarantees were illusions. The only real choice was between trying to be better or resigning himself to being exactly what everyone already believed him to be. I accept. The words came out steady despite the fear twisting in his gut. 5 years of oversight, external audits, whatever Parliament requires. I'll prove that the Northern Territories can be governed through law instead of fear. Everhart's expression softened slightly. I hope you're right, Thornfield, because if you fail, there won't be a third chance. Parliament will strip your title and redistribute your lands without hesitation. I won't fail. It was either the truth or the most desperate lie Cassian had ever told. He wasn't sure which. The probationary arrangement was formalized within a week. Parliament debated behind closed doors and emerged with a compromise that satisfied no one but prevented civil war. Cassian would retain his title and his lands, but under conditions that limited his authority in ways that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. External auditors would review his finances quarterly. Major decisions about trade and taxation would require approval from a council that included representatives from neighboring duchies. Disputes with his nobles would be adjudicated by crown-appointed justices rather than his personal judgment. It was humiliating. Every constraint was a public admission that the Iron Duke couldn't be trusted to govern without supervision. Every limitation was a signal to his enemies that he was weaker now than he'd ever been. And every restriction would make governing harder because bureaucracy moved slower than unilateral decisions, and emergencies didn't wait for committee approval. But Cassian signed the documents anyway. He stood before Parliament and swore to abide by oversight that felt like a noose around his authority. He accepted conditions that made his staff nervous and his remaining enemies gleeful. And he did it knowing that this was either the beginning of something better or the slow death of everything he'd built. The only person who seemed confident it was the former was Serafina. You did the right thing, she said on the carriage ride back to their London townhouse. I know it doesn't feel like victory, but accepting oversight takes more courage than any battle you've ever fought. Cassian stared out the window at London streets. Does it? Because it feels like surrender. That's because you've spent 8 years believing that compromise was weakness, but what you did in that chamber was the opposite of weak. You chose vulnerability over control. You bet everything that being better matters more than being feared. And that's the bravest thing I've ever seen you do. Cassian turned to look at her. And if I'm wrong, if they use oversight to destroy me piece by piece, then we'll deal with it together. Serafina took his hand. But I don't think you're wrong. I think people are tired of tyrants. I think England wants to believe that nobles can govern through law instead of fear. And I think you just gave them a reason to believe it. He wanted to share her optimism, wanted to trust that accepting vulnerability wouldn't just give his enemies the weapons they needed to finish what Blackwell started. But 8 years of survival through strength had taught him that trust was dangerous and hope got you killed. Unlearning those lessons felt impossible, still. Looking at Serafina's face, at the woman who'd defended him and saved him, and was now asking him to believe that being better was worth the risk. Cassian thought maybe impossible was just another word for hard, and he'd built an empire on doing hard things that no one else could. Maybe he could do this too. They returned to Thornfield 6 weeks after the battle to find reconstruction well underway. The eastern wall was being rebuilt with stone from local quarries. The burned buildings were slowly rising from ash. The courtyard where 43 people had died defending their duke was being transformed back into a place where children could play and merchants could trade, and life could continue despite everything. It was slower than Cassian would have done it, more expensive, more complicated because now decisions required committee approval and external audits meant justifying every expenditure. But it was also more sustainable. The nobles who'd resented his unilateral authority were now part of the rebuilding process. The merchants who'd feared his trade policies were helping design systems that worked for everyone. The servants who'd obeyed out of fear were starting to voice opinions about how Thornfield should function. It was messy and frustrating and went against every instinct Cassian had about how to get things done efficiently. But it was also creating something that looked less like a fortress under siege and more like a functioning community. And that mattered. Maybe more than efficiency ever had. The first test of the new system came 2 months into reconstruction. A dispute between tenant farmers and a noble about land boundaries. The old Cassian would have investigated personally, made a unilateral decision, and enforced it without appeal. The new system required bringing in crown-appointed arbiters, hearing testimony from both sides, building consensus rather than imposing judgment. It took 3 weeks instead of 3 days, but when the decision was reached, both sides accepted it. No one felt cheated, no one feared retribution, and the noble who'd been preparing to challenge Cassian's authority walked away convinced that maybe the new system actually protected his interests better than the old one. Small victories, incremental progress, the kind of change that happened slowly enough that enemies couldn't exploit it and quickly enough that people noticed. Cassian hated how long everything took, but he couldn't argue with results. The northern territories were more stable now than they'd been in years, not because people feared him, but because they were starting to believe the system was fair. It was working against all his cynical expectations. It was actually working. 6 months into the probationary period, Serafina told him she was pregnant. They were in their chambers late at night when she said it. Quiet words that changed everything. Cassian stared at her, trying to process the implications. A child, an heir, a future that extended beyond just surviving long enough to rebuild what Blackwell had destroyed. A reason to keep trying to be better, instead of reverting to what was comfortable. "Are you happy?" Serafina's voice was uncertain. Cassian pulled her close. "Terrified. I'm absolutely terrified. That's not what I asked." "I know." He pressed his forehead against hers. "I'm also happier than I have any right to be. Because this means we're building something real. Something that lasts. Something worth more than just empire and power and all the things I thought mattered. Good." Serafina's smile was soft. "Because I need you to be that person. Not the Iron Duke. Just Cassian. The father. The husband. The man who's trying to be better even when it's hard." Cassian felt something fundamental settle in his chest. A certainty that had been missing for months. He was going to make this work. Not because he was strong enough or ruthless enough or feared enough, but because he had a reason to be better than survival. Because the woman in his arms had given him something worth protecting that had nothing to do with power or territory or reputation. She'd given him a future, and that future required becoming someone capable of living in it. "I'll try," he said quietly. "Every day. I'll try to be the man you think I am instead of the monster I was. You already are." Serafina kissed him softly. "You just haven't figured it out yet." The baby was born in early autumn when Thornfield's gardens were full of harvest and the air smelled like wood smoke and changing seasons. A daughter with Serafina's eyes and Cassian's stubborn refusal to sleep when she was supposed to. They named her Eleanor after a grandmother Cassian barely remembered, and who'd reportedly been the only Thornfield in generations to die peacefully in her bed surrounded by family. It seemed like a good omen. Holding his daughter for the first time, Cassian felt the last piece of the Iron Duke die. This child would grow up in a different world than the one he'd built through fear. She would inherit systems instead of sieges, laws instead of unilateral judgment, a duchy governed through consensus rather than intimidation. And she would never have to understand what it felt like to carry everything alone, because survival was the only thing that mattered and trust got you killed. She would have better, because he was going to build it. One slow, frustrating compromise at a time. 2 years into the probationary period, Parliament conducted a formal review of Thornfield's governance. External auditors examined finances and found them transparent. Neighboring duchies testified that disputes were being handled fairly. Merchants reported that trade policies were consistent and predictable. Tenant farmers said they had legal recourse when nobles overstepped. Servants spoke about working conditions that respected their dignity. It was everything Cassian had never bothered to build when he was busy being strong enough to control outcomes through force. And now that it existed, the difference was undeniable. The northern territories weren't just stable, they were thriving. Not because people feared the Duke of Thornfield, but because they believed the system would protect them. The review concluded with a recommendation that oversight be reduced earlier than the original 5-year timeline. The Cassian had demonstrated the ability to govern responsibly within constraints and deserved increased autonomy as recognition of his efforts to reform. It should have felt like victory, like vindication, proof that trying to be better had been worth the risk. But standing in Thornfield's great hall reading the review's findings, Cassian felt something more complicated than triumph. He felt grateful. Not to Parliament, not to the auditors who'd verified his transformation, but to the woman standing beside him who'd believed he could be better before he believed it himself, who'd defended him when he didn't deserve it, who'd built alliances while he was busy being a monster. Who'd given him a reason to become someone worth defending instead of someone who survived through fear alone? We did it. Serafina's voice was soft. You actually did it. Cassian shook his head. We did it. I would have failed without you, without the coalition you built, without your insistence that being better was possible. I was just strong enough to survive. You made survival worth something. Serafina's smile was the kind that made everything worthwhile. Then I guess we're even. Because you taught me that strength isn't the enemy of kindness. That sometimes you need to be ruthless to protect what matters. That the world doesn't always reward being better, but that's not a reason to stop trying. Eleanor toddled into the hall at that moment with her nurse following anxiously behind. The child made straight for Cassian with the confidence of someone who'd never known a world where her father was feared rather than loved. He picked her up and she immediately grabbed his hair and yanked with the casual cruelty of 2-year-olds everywhere. Serafina laughed. She definitely inherited your stubbornness. God help us all. But Cassian was smiling. A real smile. The kind he couldn't remember making in the years before Serafina entered his life. The kind that felt like maybe this was what happiness looked like when you stopped fighting long enough to notice it. They stood together in the Great Hall, where 3 years ago Cassian had married a woman he barely knew for purely strategic reasons. Where he'd built an empire on fear and defended it through strength and nearly lost everything because he didn't understand that power without purpose was just violence waiting to consume itself. Where he'd finally learned that being the Iron Duke meant being alone. And being alone meant surviving, but never actually living. The hall looked different now. Less like a fortress. More like a home. There were tapestries Serafina had commissioned showing Thornfield's history without glorifying its violence. Portraits of Eleanor that would remind future dukes that family mattered more than empire. Windows that let in light instead of being optimized for defense. Small changes that added up to a fundamental transformation in how this place felt. It felt like somewhere worth coming home to instead of somewhere you defended because the alternative was death. That night, after Eleanor was asleep and the castle was quiet, Cassian found himself on the battlements where he'd stood 3 years ago, watching storm clouds gather before his wedding. The same view, the same northern territories stretching toward darkness. But everything was different. The lands below weren't held through fear anymore. They were governed through systems that worked even when he wasn't personally enforcing them. The nobles weren't afraid of him. They were cooperating because the new arrangement protected their interests. The people weren't loyal out of terror. They were loyal because they believed the duchy was worth defending. And Cassian wasn't the Iron Duke anymore. He was just a man trying to be better than he'd been. Trying to build something for his daughter that looked like a future instead of an endless siege. Trying to prove every day that accepting vulnerability had been courage instead of weakness. Serafina joined him in the darkness. She moved beside him at the wall, and they stood together looking out at everything they'd fought to protect. Do you regret it? Cassian asked quietly. Marrying me? Getting dragged into this life? Serafina was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke with the honesty that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Sometimes, when things were darkest, when I thought we might lose everything, I regretted not having a simpler life. She turned to face him. But I never regretted you. Not once. Because you're the most complicated, frustrating, impossible man I've ever met. And you're also the only person who's ever made me feel like I could be more than what my father tried to sell me as. You gave me purpose, partnership, a reason to fight for something beyond just survival. Her smile was soft in the darkness. So no, I don't regret marrying you. I regret that it took a war to make you realize being strong and being good aren't mutually exclusive. Cassian pulled her close. I spent 8 years being strong, and it took you exactly 3 months to prove I'd been doing it wrong the entire time. Not wrong, Serafina corrected. Incomplete. You knew how to survive. I taught you how to live. That's not the same thing. She was right. Survival was what you did when you had no other choice. Living was what happened when you stopped fighting long enough to notice that existence could be more than just defense and deterrence. That meaning came from connection rather than control. That legacy was measured in children who never learned to fear their father, rather than territories that trembled at his name. Cassian had spent 30 years learning how to survive. And in 3 years, Serafina had taught him that survival alone was just slow death, that the point wasn't to endure until you couldn't anymore. The point was to build something worth enduring for. Below them, Thornfield Castle stood against the northern darkness. Rebuilt. Reformed. transformed from a fortress under constant siege into something that looked almost like a home. There would be more challenges, more enemies who saw the reformed Duke of Thornfield as weak and tested his boundaries. More moments when every instinct screamed to revert to what was comfortable and familiar and brutal. But Cassian had something now he'd never had before. A reason to keep trying even when trying was harder than surrendering to old instincts. He had Serafina. He had Eleanor. He had a future that extended beyond his own lifespan. He had proof that being better was possible even when it felt impossible. And maybe that was enough. Maybe the measure of a man wasn't how strong he was, or how many enemies he'd crushed, or how thoroughly he'd defended what was his. Maybe the measure was simpler than that. Maybe it was just whether, at the end of his life, he could look at what he'd built and know it was worth the cost. Know that the people he loved were safe, and the systems he created would outlast him, and the legacy he left wasn't just fear, but actual progress towards something better. The Iron Duke would have laughed at that thought, would have called it weakness and sentiment and exactly the kind of thinking that got naive men killed. But Cassian wasn't the Iron Duke anymore. That man had died in the ruins of a battle he'd barely survived. Died slowly over 3 years of accepting oversight and learning diplomacy and discovering that vulnerability could be strength if you had the right person standing beside you. In his place was someone new, someone still figuring out who he was beyond survival and strength, someone trying to be a good father and a better husband and a duke who governed through wisdom instead of fear. Someone who failed regularly, but kept trying because his daughter was watching, and his wife believed in him, and the Northern Territories deserved a future that looked different than their past. Someone who'd learned that the hardest battle wasn't the one you fought with swords. It was the one you fought against your own nature, against the instinct to control instead of trust, against the certainty that strength alone was sufficient, against the fear that being better meant being weak. Cassian had fought that battle for 3 years. And he was starting to think he might actually win it, not through force or intimidation or any of the tools he'd relied on before, but through something simpler and infinitely harder, through choosing every day to be the person Serafina thought he could become instead of the monster everyone expected him to remain. Standing on the battlements with his wife beside him and his daughter sleeping safely below, and the Northern Territories stretching toward a future he'd helped build, Cassian Thornfield understood finally what strength actually meant. It wasn't the ability to crush enemies or defend walls or survive through sheer force of will. It was the courage to change when changing felt like dying, the willingness to accept that you'd been wrong, the determination to build something better even when building was harder than destroying. It was choosing to live instead of just survive, and making that choice every single day until it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like who you actually were. The wind picked up. Cold northern wind that carried the smell of winter coming and harvest ending and the world preparing for darkness. But inside Thornfield's walls, lights burned warm and steady. Eleanor would wake soon and demand attention with the imperious certainty of toddlers everywhere. Serafina would handle the morning's correspondence while Cassian met with the oversight committee to review the quarter's finances. Life would continue with all its mundane complications and bureaucratic frustrations and moments of joy hidden between the difficult work of governing responsibly. It wasn't the empire Cassian had imagined building at 17. It wasn't the legacy the Iron Duke would have recognized. But looking at it now, he couldn't imagine wanting anything else. This was enough. This was everything. And if somewhere in the darkness, enemies were plotting and Blackwell was nursing grudges, and new challenges were gathering like storm clouds on the horizon, that was fine. Cassian would face them, but not alone, not as a monster, and not with the belief that strength alone would save him. He'd face them as someone who'd learned that being better was worth every impossible effort it required. As a husband, a father, a duke who governed through law instead of fear, a man who'd survived the destruction of everything he thought defined him, and discovered that what remained was worth infinitely more than what he'd lost. As someone who'd finally figured out that the opposite of strength wasn't weakness, it was humanity. And humanity was what made survival worth the effort. Serafina shivered slightly in the cold. "We should go inside, in a minute." Cassian kept his eyes on the horizon. "I'm just remembering what it felt like before, when standing here meant calculating threats and planning defenses and waiting for the next enemy to appear. And now? Now it feels like home." Serafina leaned against him. "Good. Because that's what we built. Not a fortress, a home. And that's worth more than any empire ever was." She was right, as always. They turned away from the battlements together and walked back into warmth and light and the sound of their daughter waking up demanding attention and the mundane, beautiful chaos of a life built on something more solid than fear. Behind them, the northern territories spread into darkness, governed, protected, evolving slowly towards something better than what they'd been. The Iron Duke was gone. In his place was just a man trying to be worthy of the people who believed in him, trying to build a future his daughter could inherit without inheriting his mistakes, trying to prove every day that change was possible, even for someone who'd spent years believing change was surrender. It was hard. It would always be hard. But standing in Thornfield Castle with Seraphina's hand in his and Eleanor's voice calling from upstairs and the weight of 8 years of cruelty finally lifting from his shoulders, Cassian understood that hard was worth it, that the most important battles were the ones you fought against yourself, that strength without wisdom was just violence waiting to destroy you, and that the greatest legacy wasn't empire or fear or even survival. It was becoming someone your family could love without flinching. He'd spent 30 years learning how to fight, and 3 years learning that the real courage was knowing when to stop fighting and start building instead. It wasn't the story he'd expected to tell. It wasn't the legend the Iron Duke would have wanted, but it was true. And truth was the only legacy worth leaving. So Cassian climbed the stairs to his daughter's room, where Seraphina was already soothing her awake. He joined them in the warm light of morning beginning, and he smiled. Because this was what winning actually looked like when you stopped measuring victory in territory held and enemies crushed. This was what happiness felt like when you finally learned that being feared meant being alone and being loved meant being vulnerable, and only one of those was worth the risk. This was life, real life, the kind that happened after the battles ended and the stories were told and the hero stopped being a hero and started being human. And it was enough. It was everything. It was worth every impossible moment that had brought him here, worth fighting for, worth changing for, worth becoming someone better for, worth everything.